The woman who stepped off that dusty train wasn't supposed to change everything, but she did. When Luke Callahan saw her face, he knew immediately something was wrong. "I'm not who you ordered," she whispered, and those 6 words shattered every dream he'd built in his mind. But what happened next in Dust Valley would prove that sometimes the wrong person arrives at exactly the right time. Stay with me until the end, and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story traveled. The desert had a way of making promises it never intended to keep. Luke Callahan had learned that lesson young, growing up in the unforgiving stretch of land between the Red Rock Mountains and the alkaline flats they called Dust Valley. He'd learned it when his father's cattle withered during the drought of '81. He'd learned it again when his mother's cough turned to blood, and the nearest doctor was 3 days' ride away. And he'd learned it every damn morning when he woke up alone in a ranch house built for a family, surrounded by silence so thick it felt like drowning. But standing on that wooden platform with the noon sun beating down on his shoulders and sweat already darkening his collar, Luke thought maybe, just maybe, the desert was finally ready to give something back. The train had been late, as trains to Dust Valley always were. The nearest major line ran 40 miles east, and this spur that cut through the valley was more afterthought than infrastructure. Maintained just barely enough to keep the mining companies supplied and the handful of stubborn settlers connected to civilization. The platform was nothing more than weathered planks and a lean-to roof that provided shade for about 3 square feet, and even that was a generous estimate. Luke had been there since dawn. He'd ridden into town before the sun broke the horizon, his mare Cassie moving at an easy lope through the purple light of early morning. He'd stopped at the boarding house to wash his face, paid Mrs. Chen 2 bits for a shave that left his jaw smooth and smelling of bay rum, and spent another precious dollar on a new shirt from Morrison's General Store. Blue cotton, barely wrinkled, the closest thing to fancy he could manage without riding all the way to Silver Creek. The ring box in his vest pocket felt like it weighed 10 pounds. He'd bought it 6 months ago, back when the letters first started arriving, back when Evelyn Harper's careful handwriting had begun showing up in his mailbox at the post office. Each envelope like a small miracle in a life that had long since stopped believing in them. The first letter had been formal, almost businesslike. She'd seen his advertisement in the Matrimonial Times, one of those publications that connected lonely men in the territories with women back east looking for a fresh start. Luke had placed the ad on a whiskey-fueled night of weakness, never really expecting anyone to respond. Hell, what did he have to offer? A struggling ranch? A house that needed repairs? A life measured in endless work and scarce reward. But Evelyn had written back. "Dear Mr. Callahan, that first letter had begun. I hope this correspondence finds you well. I am writing in response to your advertisement, and while I understand you may have received many such letters, I hope you might consider mine with some measure of seriousness." It had gone on like that, proper and careful, telling him about her life in Philadelphia, about the death of her parents, about working as a seamstress in her aunt's shop. Nothing too personal, nothing too revealing, just enough to make him curious. He'd written back that same night. Over the months that followed, the letters had grown warmer, longer, more intimate in the way they revealed small truths about lives lived half a continent apart. She wrote about missing the sunset because the buildings in Philadelphia blocked the horizon. He wrote about watching the sun go down over the red rocks every evening, painting the sky in colors that had no name. She wrote about loneliness in a crowded city. He wrote about loneliness and empty spaces. Somewhere in those exchanged pages, something had grown between them. Not quite love. How could it be? Between strangers who'd never met. But something close enough to make him hope. Close enough to make him save money for a ticket. Close enough to make him buy a ring. Close enough to bring him to this platform, heart hammering against his ribs, watching the distant plume of smoke that marked the train's approach. The locomotive appeared first as a dark spot in the heat shimmer, gradually resolving into solid iron and steam as it drew closer. The screech of brakes echoed across the valley, and Luke's mouth went dry. His hands trembled slightly as he removed his hat, running fingers through hair he'd slicked back with pomade that morning. Another extravagance, another gesture toward becoming someone worthy of the woman in those letters. The train shuddered to a complete stop, steam billowing from beneath the carriages in great white clouds. The conductor, a grizzled man named Pete, who'd been running this route since before Luke was born, swung down from the engine car and tipped his cap. "Afternoon, Luke," Pete called. "She's a hot one today?" "That she is," Luke managed, barely hearing his own voice over the thunder of his pulse. 3 passengers disembarked from the second car. First came Thomas Reynolds, who owned the assay office and had been visiting his daughter in Kansas City. Then Martha Yates, the schoolteacher, returning from some educational conference she'd been excited about for months. Luke barely registered them, his eyes fixed on the third figure, a woman. She stood on the metal step for a moment, one hand gripping the rail, the other clutching a worn carpet bag that had seen better years. Her dress was simple, gray cotton, practical, the kind working women wore because they couldn't afford anything else. The hem was dusty from travel, and he could see where it had been let out and taken in multiple times, patches sewn with careful, nearly invisible stitches. But it was her face that made his breath catch. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 23 or 24, with dark hair pulled back in a simple bun that emphasized high cheekbones and a delicate jawline. Her eyes, he couldn't quite make out the color from this distance, but they seemed dark, shadowed, swept across the platform with something that looked like fear. This was her. This was Evelyn. This was the woman who'd written about Philadelphia sunsets and the smell of fresh bread from the bakery on her corner, and how she'd always imagined what it might be like to see real stars, unobscured by city lights and coal smoke. Luke stepped forward, his new boots, also purchased for this occasion, clicking on the wooden planks. He tried to smile, tried to look welcoming and confident, and like the kind of man worth traveling 2,000 miles to meet. His hand moved automatically to his hat, tipping it in greeting. "Miss Evelyn Harper?" His voice came out rougher than intended, scraped raw by nerves and dust. The woman's eyes found his. For a long moment she just stared, her expression unreadable. The carpet bag slipped slightly in her grip, and she adjusted it with fingers that trembled visibly, even from several feet away. Then she shook her head, slowly, deliberately. "No," she said, and her voice was soft, barely audible over the hiss of the settling train. "I'm not who you ordered." The words didn't make sense at first. Luke's smile froze on his face, confusion flooding through him like cold water. He took another step closer, certain he'd misheard, certain the rattle of the train, or the wind, or his own hammering heart had distorted her words into something impossible. "I'm sorry, what did you—" "I'm not Evelyn Harper," the woman said, clearer now, and Luke could hear the tremor in her voice, see the way her knuckles whitened on the handle of her bag. I shouldn't be here. I should have sent a telegram. I should have written, but I didn't know how to—" She trailed off, and Luke felt the platform tilt beneath his feet. The world narrowed to this moment, this woman, these words that were dismantling everything he built in his mind over 6 months of letters and dreams. "Then who the hell are you?" The question came out sharper than he intended, edged with hurt and confusion and something close to anger, not at her, but at the universe for this cruel joke, this cosmic mistake. The woman flinched, but held his gaze. "My name is Clara." She paused, swallowed hard. "Clara Harper. Evelyn was my sister." Was. Past tense. Luke's brain caught on that single word like a burr on clothing, snagging, tearing. Was. Clara's eyes glistened, and she looked away, focusing on something in the middle distance. The distant mountains, maybe. Just the empty horizon. She didn't make it through the winter. The consumption, it took her in January. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Callahan. I'm so very sorry." The ring box in Luke's pocket might as well have turned to lead. He stood frozen, trying to process information that refused to fit into any framework that made sense. Evelyn was dead. The woman who'd written about loneliness and sunsets and new beginnings was gone. Had been gone for months while he'd been planning and saving and hoping, but the letters hadn't stopped in January. "I don't understand," he said, and his voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. "The letters kept coming. I got one just 3 weeks ago about seeing the desert, about starting fresh, about—" "That was me," Claire's voice cracked. "I kept writing them. After she died, I found all your letters to her, and I read them, and I couldn't bear to—" "She'd been so happy, Mr. Callahan." For the first time in years, she had something to look forward to. Even when she got sicker, even when we both knew she wouldn't recover, she'd spend her good hours writing to you. And after she passed, I couldn't let it end. I couldn't let you wonder what happened. So I kept the correspondence going, thinking maybe I could find a way to tell you gently, to explain. But then the ticket arrived, and she was crying now, silent tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. Luke wanted to feel angry, wanted to rage at the deception, the months of false hope. But all he felt was hollow, carved out, empty as the desert that stretched in all directions. The train whistle blew, a sharp, piercing sound that made them both jump. Pete, the conductor, was already climbing back into the engine car, ready to depart. The whole stop in Dust Valley never lasted more than 15 minutes. "You should go," Luke heard himself say. "Get back on the train. There's nothing for you here." Clara wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving a smudge of dirt across her cheekbone. "I know. I needed you to know the truth. I needed to see you, to apologize in person. Evelyn would have wanted that. She spoke about you constantly at the end, about the life she imagined you two would build. She made me promise that if she didn't make it, I'd come here and tell you myself. Not a letter, not a telegram, face to face." "Well, you've kept your promise," Luke said, and even he could hear the bitterness in his tone. Message delivered. The whistle blew again, more insistent this time. Pete was waving at Clara from the engine, gesturing for her to board. The train would leave with or without her, and the next one wouldn't come for 3 days. Clara picked up her carpet bag, gripping it with both hands now like it might anchor her against the weight of what was happening. She took a step toward the train, then stopped. Her hand went to her own bag, not the carpet bag, but a smaller one, more like a purse, hanging from her shoulder. She fumbled with the clasp, her fingers clumsy with emotion. "Wait," she said. "There's something else. Something she wanted you to have." She pulled out an envelope, its edges soft with handling, the paper yellowed slightly. Luke recognized Evelyn's handwriting on the front. "For Luke Callahan, if I cannot deliver it myself." Clara held it out to him, her hand shaking. She wrote this the week before she died. She knew she wasn't going to make it, knew she'd never board that train. But she wanted you to understand, to know that what you shared, even through letters, even at a distance, it meant everything to her. Luke stared at the envelope like it might bite him. Part of him wanted to refuse it, to let Clara take it back on the train and remove this entire impossible situation from his life. But his hand moved of its own accord, reaching out, taking the letter. The paper felt impossibly light in his fingers. "Mr. Callahan, Clara's voice broke completely. She pressed her lips together, trying to compose herself. "I'm sorry. For everything. For not telling you sooner, for pretending to be her. For giving you hope when there wasn't any. I thought I was honoring her wishes, but I see now I was just being a coward, putting off the inevitable, because I couldn't bear to break someone's heart from 2,000 miles away." The train was moving now, just barely, wheels beginning their slow revolution. Pete was leaning out of the engine car, shouting something Luke couldn't make out over the building noise. Clara turned and ran for the train, her skirts kicking up dust, the carpet bag banging against her leg. She grabbed the rail of the passenger car and pulled herself up onto the step, just as the train began to pick up speed. And Luke stood there, watching her go, the letter clutched in his hand and his heart a confused tangle of grief and anger and something else he couldn't quite name. But then, he looked down at the envelope, at Evelyn's handwriting, at the careful loops and curves that had become familiar over months of correspondence. And he thought about what Clara had said. She made me promise that if she didn't make it, I'd come here and tell you myself. Clara had traveled 2,000 miles to keep a dying woman's promise. She'd stepped off a train into hostile territory, faced a stranger's confusion and hurt, delivered news she must have dreaded giving. And now she was leaving, heading back to... what? Philadelphia? An aunt's seamstress shop? The empty rooms where her sister had died? His feet moved before his brain caught up. "Wait!" Luke shouted, already running toward the train. "Clara, wait!" She heard him somehow over the noise of the engine. He saw her head turn, saw her eyes widen in surprise. The train was picking up speed, but it was still slow enough, still close enough. Luke ran alongside the passenger car, his boots pounding the packed earth beside the tracks. He grabbed the rail with his free hand and hauled himself up onto the step beside Clara, the momentum nearly sending them both sprawling. "Mr. Callahan, what are you—" "Don't go," he said, breathing hard, still gripping the rail. "Not yet. Not like this." Clara stared at him, confusion and something like hope growing in her expression. "I don't understand." Luke didn't either. Not really. He just knew that letting this woman disappear back into the vast distance she'd crossed felt wrong. Felt like giving up on something that hadn't even had a chance to begin. "The letter," he said, holding up the envelope. "Let me read it first. Let me understand what happened. And then if you still want to leave, if you need to leave, I'll write you a letter of recommendation for employment. I'll give you money for the ticket, whatever you need. But don't go like this. Don't leave thinking you did something wrong by coming here." The train was really moving now, the platform receding behind it. Clara looked back at Dust Valley, at the ramshackle buildings and empty streets of a town that was barely a town at all. "I can't stay," she said softly. "I have no money for lodging, no—" "You can stay at my place," Luke said, then immediately realized how that sounded. "I mean, there's a guest room, my mother's room. It's been empty for years, but it's clean, it's respectable. Mrs. Chen at the boarding house can chaperone if you're worried about propriety. Just give me a day. Let me read this letter. Let me figure out what to say, and then tomorrow I'll take you back to the station myself if that's what you want." Clara searched his face, looking for something. Sincerity, maybe, or madness. Luke wasn't sure which she'd find. He wasn't sure which he was offering. But then, slowly, she nodded. "One day," she said. "But I won't impose on you, Mr. Callahan. I'll work for my keep, help with whatever needs doing. I won't be a burden." "You're not a burden," Luke said, and meant it. You're someone who kept a promise. That means something out here." He signaled to Pete, who'd been watching this entire exchange with undisguised interest. The conductor pulled a lever, and the train began to slow, brakes screaming against the wheels. It took nearly a quarter mile before they came to a complete stop. "You two figure things out?" Pete called back, grinning like this was the most entertainment he'd had all week. "Working on it," Luke replied. They climbed down from the train, Luke first, then offering his hand to help Clara navigate the high step. Her fingers were small in his, calloused in a way that spoke of hard work, of a life that hadn't been easy. When she was safely on the ground, she pulled her hand back quickly, as if the contact had burned. The train pulled away with a final blast of its whistle, leaving them standing in a cloud of steam and settling dust. The platform was empty now, the other passengers having long since dispersed into town. It was just the two of them and the relentless sun, and the letter still clutched in Luke's hand. "My horse is at the livery," Luke said, suddenly awkward. "It's about a 2-mile ride to the ranch. You can ride with me, or I can rent a wagon if you'd prefer." "I can ride," Clara said quietly. "Evelyn and I grew up on a farm before our parents died. I'm comfortable on horseback." Luke nodded, filing away that piece of information. Another thing he didn't know about the Harper sisters. Another detail that Evelyn's letters hadn't revealed. How much else didn't he know? How much of what he thought he knew was real, and how much was fiction crafted by a dying woman and her well-meaning sister? They walked toward the livery in silence, the dust muffling their footsteps. Morrison's general store was closed for the afternoon heat, as was the assay office. Only the saloon showed signs of life, raucous laughter spilling through its swinging doors. Clara kept her eyes forward, but Luke saw her grip tighten on her carpet bag when a drunk stumbled out onto the street. "It's not always like this," Luke found himself saying. "Dust Valley, I mean. It's rough, but there are good people here. Families. The school teacher you saw on the train, Mrs. Yates, she runs a lending library out of her house. And Mrs. Chen makes the best dumplings west of San Francisco. It's not Philadelphia, but it's not lawless frontier either." Clara glanced at him, a small, sad smile touching her lips. Evelyn's letters made it sound like paradise. Wide open spaces, stars so thick you could read by them, air that didn't taste like coal smoke. She was so tired of the city, Mr. Callahan, so tired of gray skies and crowded streets, and her voice caught. and coughing up blood in a tenement room while strangers pounded on the walls and told us to be quiet. The image hit Luke like a fist to the gut. All those letters about fresh starts and new beginnings, and he'd never really understood what she was running from or trying to run toward. "I'm sorry," he said, inadequate words for a loss he was only beginning to comprehend. "So am I." They reached the livery where old Tom was dozing in the shade. Luke paid him for Cassie's keeping and led the mare out into the sunlight. She nickered softly, nosing at his pockets for the sugar cubes he usually brought. "Sorry, girl," he murmured. "Forgot today." Clara approached slowly, offering her hand for Cassie to sniff. The horse, usually skittish around strangers, accepted the attention calmly. Clara stroked her nose with surprising confidence. "She's beautiful," Clara said. "What's her name?" "Cassie, short for Cassiopeia. My mother named her, said she had stars in her coat." Luke ran a hand along the mare's flank, feeling the familiar comfort of her warmth. "Help you up?" Clara nodded, and Luke made a stirrup of his hands, boosting her into the saddle. She sat side saddle automatically, arranging her skirts with practiced ease. Luke swung up behind her, acutely aware of her proximity, the faint scent of lavender water clinging to her despite the long journey. "Hold on," he said, and felt her hands grip his arms lightly as he urged Cassie into a walk. They rode through town and out onto the desert road, the afternoon sun beating down mercilessly. But Clara didn't complain about the heat, or the dust, or the jarring gait of the horse. She just held on and watched the landscape unfold, and Luke wondered what she saw: desolation or possibility, prison or freedom. The letter in his pocket seemed to pulse with weight, demanding attention. But not yet. Not while they were riding, not while Clara was pressed against his back, silent and fragile and real, in a way the letters had never been. The ranch came into view after about 40 minutes, a sprawling collection of buildings dominated by the main house, a two-story structure with a wraparound porch and shutters that hung slightly crooked. The barn needed paint, the fences needed mending, and the vegetable garden had gone mostly to seed. It was, Luke realized with fresh embarrassment, exactly the kind of struggling operation a woman might look at, and immediately regret her decision to come west. But Clara didn't say anything as he helped her down from the horse. She just stood there, carpetbag in hand, looking at the house with an expression he couldn't read. "It needs work," Luke admitted. "I've been meaning to fix things up, but running the place alone doesn't leave much time for repairs." "It's solid," Clara said, surprisingly. "Good bones. My father always said you could tell a lot about a man by his buildings. If they're standing straight despite the wind, you know he's the stubborn type who doesn't quit easy." Luke didn't know what to say to that, so he just led her inside. The main room was clean, at least. He'd spent yesterday evening sweeping and dusting, preparing for Evelyn's arrival. The furniture was sparse but serviceable. A sofa his mother had insisted on bringing from back east, a table he'd built himself from pine, chairs that didn't quite match but served their purpose. "Guest room's upstairs," he said, gesturing toward the stairs. "First door on the left. There's a pitcher and basin for washing, and I'll bring up some fresh water from the well. Supper's not for a few hours yet, so you can rest if you'd like." Clara nodded, but instead of heading upstairs, she turned to face him directly. "Mr. Callahan, I want you to know I meant what I said. I'll work for my keep. I can cook, clean, mend, whatever needs doing. I won't sit idle while you provide for me." "Clara, please," she said, and there was something almost desperate in her voice. "Let me do this. Let me feel like less of an intruder." Luke studied her, this woman who was and wasn't the person he'd been expecting, who'd traveled across a continent to deliver bad news in person, who stood in his home looking both determined and lost. "You're not an intruder," he said finally, "and we'll figure out the rest tomorrow. For now, just rest, please." She hesitated, then nodded and made her way upstairs, her footsteps soft on the wooden step. Luke heard the guest room door open and close, and then silence settled over the house like dust. He stood in the empty parlor, the letter still in his hand, and finally let himself feel the full weight of what had happened. Evelyn was dead. The woman he'd been writing to, building dreams around, she'd been gone for months. And in her place was Clara, a stranger wearing her sister's face, carrying her sister's final words. Luke sat down at the table and carefully opened the envelope. The letter inside was 2 pages, covered front and back in Evelyn's careful script. His hands shook slightly as he began to read. My dearest Luke, if you're reading this, then Clara kept her promise, and I am gone. I'm writing this from my bed where I've spent most of the last 3 months. The doctor says it won't be much longer now, a week, perhaps 2. The consumption has won, as we knew it would. I wish I could tell you this in person. I wish I could see your face just once before I go. I've imagined it so many times, built it from the descriptions in your letters. Kind eyes, you said, though you called them ordinary brown. A face weathered by sun and wind. Hands that know hard work. I've pictured you 1,000 different ways, and I suspect I'm wrong on all counts, but the image has kept me company in these final days. I need you to understand something, Luke. What we shared through our letters, it was real. Every word I wrote came from my heart. Every hope I expressed, every dream I described, they were genuine. In a life that had very little joy, you gave me something to look forward to. You gave me a reason to wake up each morning and put pen to paper, to imagine a future even when I knew I wouldn't have one. But I also need you to understand that I was selfish. I knew I was dying when I first wrote to you. The doctor had already given me his prognosis. I should have told you, should have given you the chance to walk away, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The thought of those letters stopping, of losing that connection, was more than I could bear. So I kept writing, kept pretending, kept building a fiction I knew would crumble. And when I could no longer hold the pen myself, when the coughing fits made writing impossible, I asked Clara to continue for me. I dictated the words, and she wrote them in my hand, or as close as she could manage. She didn't want to. She thought it was cruel to deceive you. But I begged, Luke. I begged her to give me this one last thing, this final comfort of knowing you were still out there, still writing back, still believing in the dream we built together. Clara is the better person. She always has been. Stronger, kinder, more honest than I could ever be. Where I am selfish and vain, she is selfless and practical. Where I dream, she builds. She took care of me these last months, sacrificed everything to sit by my bedside, and I repaid her by making her complicit in my deception. I've asked her to deliver this letter in person because I couldn't bear the thought of you learning the truth through impersonal words on a page. You deserve more than that. You deserve to see the face of someone who cares, even if it's not the face you expected. If you're angry, I understand. If you feel betrayed, I deserve it. But please don't be angry with Clara. She did only what I begged her to do, and she did it out of love for a dying sister who had already asked too much of her. I want you to know that in my final days, I will be thinking of Dust Valley, of red rocks at sunset and stars unobscured by city smoke, of a life I won't live, but can imagine so clearly it feels like memory. And I will be thinking of you, Luke Callahan, the kind stranger who showed a dying woman what hope feels like. If there's any chance at all that Clara might stay, that she might find in Dust Valley what I never could, please give her that chance. She'll refuse, of course. She'll insist on leaving, on not imposing, on protecting you from further entanglement with the Harper family. But she's alone now, Luke. Our parents are dead, our aunt is elderly and ailing, and I'm leaving her with nothing but debts and memories. She won't accept charity, but she might accept opportunity. She's a hard worker, skilled with needle and thread, excellent with figures. She can cook and clean and manage a household. She's everything I wasn't, practical and capable and real. This is my last request, my final selfish act. Give her a chance. Not because of me, not because of guilt or obligation, but because she deserves one. And Dust Valley sounds like the kind of place where second chances grow like wildflowers after rain. I hope you find happiness, Luke. I hope you find someone to fill that house you described, to help mend those fences and build that life you imagined. I'm sorry it won't be me. I'm sorry I wasted your time and toyed with your heart. But I'm not sorry for the letters, for the brief, beautiful fiction we created together. Thank you for giving me something to dream about at the end. With all my love and all my regret, Evelyn Harper. Luke read the letter 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of meaning, new shades of emotion. Grief sat heavy in his chest. For Evelyn, yes, but also for the future they'd imagined, the partnership that had existed only in words and wishes. But beneath the grief was something else, a strange, unexpected sense of relief? No, that wasn't quite right. More like understanding. Evelyn's letters had always felt slightly distant, slightly dreamlike, as if they were coming from someone who didn't quite belong to the solid, dusty reality of his life. Now he understood why. She'd been writing from a deathbed, crafting fiction as a final comfort, and Clara had been the one ensuring those fictions reached him, honoring a dying woman's last request even when it meant deceiving a stranger. Clara, who traveled 2,000 miles to deliver this letter in person. Clara, who was upstairs right now, probably packing her carpet bag, preparing to leave on the next train. Clara, who Evelyn had described as everything she wasn't, practical, capable, real. Luke stood up, the letter still in his hand, and climbed the stairs. He stopped outside the guest room door, raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. What was he going to say? What could he possibly say that would make sense of this impossible situation? But before he could decide, the door opened. Clara stood there, her face freshly washed, her hair still pulled back in that simple bun. She'd removed her traveling jacket, revealing a simple white blouse with mother-of-pearl buttons. Up close, Luke could see the dark circles under her eyes, the hollowness in her cheeks that spoke of months of worry and grief and insufficient food. "I heard you on the stairs," she said quietly. "You read the letter." It wasn't a question. Luke nodded anyway. "I'll leave first thing in the morning," Clara continued, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I have a little money saved, enough for the ticket back. I'll find work in Philadelphia, or maybe—" "Stay," Luke said, and the word came out more forcefully than he intended. Clara blinked. "What?" "Stay. Not forever. Not as what I was expecting when I came to that platform today. But stay. Work for me if you need to feel like you're earning your keep. Help me fix up this place. Just don't get back on that train tomorrow morning and disappear into a life that makes you as miserable as it made your sister." "Mr. Callahan, I can't—" "Luke," he interrupted, "if you're going to refuse me, at least do me the courtesy of using my given name." The ghost of a smile touched Clara's lips. "Luke, then. I appreciate the offer, truly, but it wouldn't be right. You don't know me. I deceived you for months, and now Evelyn wants me to stay and take her place like some kind of substitute bride, and that's not fair to anyone involved." "I don't want a substitute," Luke said, and realized as he spoke that it was true. I don't know what I want, honestly. An hour ago, I thought I knew exactly how my life was going to unfold. Now everything's upside down, and I'm still trying to figure out which way is up. But I know I don't want you to leave, not yet." Claire studied his face, searching for something. "Why?" It was a fair question. Luke struggled to find an answer that made sense. "Because you came here," he said finally. "Because you could have sent a telegram or a letter or nothing at all, but instead you spent what little money you had to honor a promise to a dying woman. Because in a world where most people do the easy thing, you did the hard thing. That says something about your character, Clara Harper. Something I'd like to know more about." "I don't think you'd like what you'd find," Clara said softly. "I'm not who Evelyn described in that letter. I'm not kind or selfless or any of those things. I'm practical because I've had to be. I'm honest because lies take too much energy to maintain. And I'm here because the guilt of deception was eating me alive, not because I'm some kind of noble person." "Maybe," Luke conceded. "Or maybe you're both things at once, practical and kind, honest and conflicted. People are complicated, Clara. I've learned that much in 32 years of living." They stood in the doorway, the afternoon light slanting through the window behind Clara, turning her hair to dark fire. Luke could see the war playing out in her expression, the desire to stay warring with the certainty that she shouldn't. "1 week," he offered. "Stay 1 week. If at the end of it you want to leave, I'll personally buy your ticket and drive you to the station. But give Dust Valley a week. Give me a week, and maybe at the end of it we'll both have a clear idea of what comes next." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly she nodded. 1 week, she agreed. "But I work for my keep. No charity, no pity. I earn my place here. or I don't stay at all." "Deal," Luke said, and offered his hand. Clara looked at it, then placed her hand in his, a formal shake to seal a most informal arrangement. Her skin was warm, her grip surprisingly firm. "I should warn you," she said as they released hands. "I'm not easy to live with. I'm particular about how things are done. I wake before dawn, and I have opinions about everything from fence posts to soup." Luke laughed, surprised by the sound of it. "Sounds like we'll get along fine then. I'm particular, early rising, and opinionated myself." "Then this will either work beautifully or end in disaster," Clara said, and for the first time since stepping off that train, she smiled. A real smile. Small, but genuine. "Either way," Luke said, "it'll be interesting." As Clara went back into the guest room to properly unpack, and Luke headed downstairs to start thinking about supper, neither of them noticed the letter still clutched in his hand. Evelyn's final words, her last request, her hope that something good might grow from the ashes of her dreams. The desert wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters and sending dust devils dancing across the empty yard. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out to the coming evening. And in a ranch house that had been too quiet for too long, two strangers began the complicated process of figuring out how to exist in the same space. It wasn't what either of them had expected. It wasn't what anyone had planned. But as the sun began its descent toward the Red Rock Mountains, painting the sky in those nameless colors Luke had tried to describe in his letters, it felt almost like a beginning. The kitchen smelled of coffee and wood smoke when Clara came downstairs the next morning. She'd barely slept, lying awake in the unfamiliar bed, while moonlight painted strange shadows on walls that weren't hers, listening to the sounds of a house she had no right to be in. Somewhere around 3, she'd finally dozed off, only to wake with the first bird call, her body trained by years of early rising in the seamstress shop. Luke was already at the stove, his back to her, working a cast-iron skillet over the fire. He'd rolled up his shirt sleeves, and Clara found herself noticing the strength in his forearms, the way his shoulders moved as he worked. She cleared her throat, and he turned, surprise flickering across his features. "Didn't expect you up this early," he said, then immediately looked embarrassed. "Not that you shouldn't be, I just meant, I'm used to early mornings," Clara said, saving him from further explanation. "What can I do to help?" Luke gestured toward the coffee pot. "Cups are in the cabinet above. I'm just frying some eggs and salt pork. Nothing fancy, but it fills the belly." Clara poured 2 cups of coffee, noting the way Luke took his, black, no sugar, before she'd even asked. There was something oddly intimate about these small observations, these tiny pieces of information that built a picture of who someone was. She added a small spoonful of sugar to her own cup from a tin on the counter, stirred it carefully. They ate in companionable silence, sitting across from each other at the pine table. The food was simple but well cooked, the eggs fried crisp at the edges just the way Clara liked them, though Luke couldn't have known that. Through the window, she could see the sun beginning to break over the distant mountains, painting everything gold. "I thought we could start with the garden," Luke said eventually, pushing his empty plate away. "It's gone to seed mostly, but there's still time to salvage something for fall planting, if you're willing." "I said I'd work for my keep," Claire reminded him. "Garden work is honest labor." Something shifted in Luke's expression. Approval, maybe, or respect. "Fair enough. I've got some tools in the shed, and there's an old pair of my mother's work gloves that should fit you. No sense tearing up your hands on the first day." The garden was worse than Clara had expected. What might have once been orderly rows was now a tangle of weeds and volunteer plants, the whole thing choked with amaranth and bindweed. A broken fence sagged along one edge, and a scarecrow leaned at a drunken angle, its burlap face half rotted away. Luke handed her a hoe, taking up a shovel himself. "I know it looks rough. My mother used to keep it beautiful. Tomatoes, beans, squash, herbs. After she passed, I let it go. Kept meaning to fix it up, but there's always something more pressing on a ranch this size." Clara studied the space, her practical mind already cataloging what could be saved, what needed to go, how the soil might be amended. "It's got good sun exposure," she said, "and the soil looks decent under all the weeds. With some work, this could produce again." They worked through the morning, falling into an easy rhythm. Luke broke up the hardened earth while Clara pulled weeds, piling them in a wheelbarrow to be hauled away. The sun climbed higher and sweat began to dampen Clara's collar But she didn't stop. There was something satisfying about the physical labor, the way her muscles stretched and pulled, the solid reality of dirt under her fingernails. Around mid-morning, Luke straightened, wiping his brow. "Water break," he announced, heading toward the well. Clara followed, grateful for the respite. She stripped off the work gloves. He'd been right. They fit perfectly, and accepted the tin cup he offered her. The water was cold and slightly metallic, tasting of minerals and earth. "Can I ask you something?" Luke said, not quite meeting her eyes. Clara's stomach tightened. "Of course." "The letters, the ones you wrote after Evelyn died. How much of them was her and how much was you?" It was the question Clara had been dreading, the one she'd turned over in her mind during the sleepless hours of the previous night. She could lie, could claim she'd been merely a scribe, faithfully transcribing Evelyn's words. But that would be just another deception, and she'd promised herself no more lies. "At first it was all her," Clara said slowly. "She'd dictate, and I'd write. But as she got weaker, as the morphine made her mind wander, the dictation became fragments, ideas rather than full thoughts. So I'd fill in the gaps, trying to write what I thought she'd say, what she'd want you to hear. And later, after she was gone," Clara paused, choosing her words carefully. "I read all your letters to her, every single one, and I read her responses. I tried to keep her voice, her way of seeing things. But yes, some of it was me. The last few letters especially. I'm sorry, Luke, I know that's not what you want to hear." Luke was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the half-cleared garden. "The letter about the sunset," he said finally. "The one that arrived 3 weeks ago. That described watching the sun go down, thinking about new beginnings. Was that her or you?" Clara remembered writing that letter, sitting at the small desk in the tenement room, trying to imagine what Evelyn would have said if she'd lived to see spring. "That was me," she admitted. "Evelyn never saw spring this year." "I thought so," Luke said, and there was no anger in his voice, just a quiet sadness. It felt different from the others. Less dreamlike, more grounded, more real. "I shouldn't have written it. I should have told you the truth then." "Maybe," Luke agreed, "but I'm glad you did. That letter, it helped me through a rough patch. Lost half my herd to illness that week, and I was about ready to give up on the whole enterprise. Reading about hope and new beginnings, even if it was fiction, it gave me something to hold on to." Clara looked at him, really looked at him, seeing past the initial impressions to the man beneath. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into sun and wind, a small scar on his chin that could have come from any number of ranch accidents, calluses on his hands that matched her own. He was younger than she'd expected, couldn't be more than 32 or 33, but there was something old in his eyes, something that understood loss. It wasn't all fiction, she found herself saying. The hope part, that was real. Evelyn did hope. She hoped right up until the end, hoped so hard it hurt to watch. And maybe I caught some of that hope, enough to keep writing even when I knew I shouldn't. Luke nodded slowly, then handed her the water cup again. "Come on, this garden won't clear itself, and I've got fence posts to mend this afternoon." They worked until the sun was directly overhead, the heat becoming oppressive. Clara's back ached and her hands were blistered despite the gloves, but the garden was beginning to take shape. You could see the outline of the old rows now, the promise of what it might become. "That's enough for today," Luke declared, surveying their progress. "You've earned your keep and then some. Go on inside, clean up. There's a bath chamber off the kitchen. The water won't be hot, but it'll wash off the worst of the dirt." Clara nodded gratefully and headed inside. The bath chamber was small but functional, with a copper tub and a pump that brought up well water. She stripped off her dusty clothes and washed quickly, efficiently, trying not to think about how strange it was to be bathing in a strange man's house, using soap that smelled of lye and lavender. When she emerged, clean and dressed in a fresh blouse and skirt, she found Luke at the kitchen table, papers spread out before him. He looked up as she entered, then quickly gathered the papers into a pile. "Ranch accounts," he explained. Not exactly exciting reading, but Clara had glimpsed enough to see columns of numbers, expenditures, and income carefully tracked. "You keep meticulous records," she observed. "Have to. Banks don't lend to ranchers who can't prove they're solvent. He paused, then seemed to make a decision. Speaking of which, I should probably explain the arrangement here. Room and board in exchange for help around the place. That's fair enough. But if you're staying the week, you should know how things stand financially. Oh, you don't have to. I want to, Luke interrupted. No secrets, remember? No deceptions. The ranch is struggling but stable. I've got about 30 head of cattle, a few horses, some chickens. I sell beef to the mining companies when I can, take odd jobs in town when I can't. It's not prosperity, but it's not poverty either. I can afford to feed another mouth, if that's what you're worried about. Clara sat down across from him, touched by his honesty. I wasn't worried about that, but thank you for telling me. Your turn, Luke said. Fair's fair. What's your situation back in Philadelphia? Clara had known this question would come, but it still took her a moment to answer. Our parents died when I was 16 and Evelyn was 18. Fever took them both within a week of each other. We went to live with our aunt, our mother's sister. She owned a seamstress shop, taught us the trade. Evelyn was better at it than me. She had an eye for design, could make something beautiful out of scraps. I was faster, more practical, good at alterations and repairs. And after Evelyn got sick, I worked 16-hour days sometimes, trying to pay for doctors and medicine. Our aunt helped when she could, but her own health was failing. When Evelyn died, there were debts. Medical bills, funeral costs. I sold what little we had. Evelyn's sewing machine, our mother's jewelry, everything except what I could carry in that carpet bag. Luke's expression darkened. You shouldn't have had to do that alone. There wasn't anyone else, Claire said simply. Our aunt passed 2 weeks before I got on that train. Heart failure, the doctor said. So I closed up the shop, settled what debts I could, and used the last of the money for the train ticket. I thought I owed it to Evelyn to see this through, to meet you in person, to explain. After that, I figured I'd find work somewhere out west, start fresh where nobody knew me. And now? Now I'm in Dust Valley, working in a garden for room and board, and I still don't know what comes next. Clara managed a small smile. But at least the garden's getting cleared. Luke laughed, a warm sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it did Clara. Fair point. One day at a time, I suppose. The afternoon passed in a blur of activity. Luke showed Clara around the ranch, the barn with its empty stalls waiting for horses he couldn't yet afford, the chicken coop where a dozen hens scratched and pecked, the smokehouse and root cellar built into the hillside. Everything was functional but weathered, marked by the kind of deferred maintenance that came from too much work and too few hands. It's a lot for one person, Clara observed as they stood looking out at the fenced pasture where Luke's cattle grazed. It is, Luke agreed. I've been thinking about hiring help, but good ranch hands are hard to find, and the ones I can find want wages I can't quite afford yet. It's a chicken and egg problem. Need more hands to expand, need to expand to afford more hands. Clara studied the layout of the ranch, her practical mind already working through possibilities. What about diversification? You've got good water access with that well. Ever thought about putting in a larger vegetable garden, selling produce in town, or keeping more chickens, selling egg? Luke looked at her with surprise. I've thought about it, but I don't know the first thing about commercial gardening. Keeping my mother's kitchen garden alive was challenge enough. I do, Clara said. My father's farm was small, but we sold vegetables and eggs at market every week. I know what grows well together, how to rotate crops, when to plant for continuous harvest. If you've got seed money, literally, I could get a proper garden going. It wouldn't be fortune-making, but it might help with the cash flow. There was a long pause while Luke considered this. Clara could see him weighing possibilities, calculating risk. Finally, he nodded slowly. Let's say I agree to this. How would it work? I'd need about $20 for seeds and starts, Clara said, the plan already forming in her mind. And access to more of that cleared land near the house. Maybe an additional quarter acre. I'd put in fast-growing crops first. Lettuce, radishes, green onions. Those can be harvested and sold within a month. Then longer season crops, tomatoes, squash, beans. By late summer, you'd have steady produce to sell. And in exchange? Clara met his eyes steadily. In exchange, I stay longer than a week, through the growing season at least. I manage the garden, sell the produce, and we split the profit 60-40. 60 for you since it's your land, 40 for me since it's my labor and knowledge. Luke extended his hand, 50-50. Equal partners in this venture. That's not fair to you. It's exactly fair, Luke interrupted. Your knowledge is worth as much as my land, maybe more. So 50-50, or no deal. Clara hesitated, then took his hand. His grip was firm, his palm warm and calloused against hers. You drive a hard bargain, Luke Callahan. So I've been told, he said with a slight smile. We'll ride into town tomorrow, get the seeds and supplies you need. Consider it an investment in the ranch's future. That evening, Clara insisted on cooking supper. Luke had been handling his own meals for years, but watching Clara move around the kitchen with quiet efficiency was a revelation. She worked with the same practical grace she'd shown in the garden, making something substantial out of simple ingredients: beans and bacon, cornbread, stewed tomatoes from jars that had been gathering dust in the pantry. They ate at the same pine table, the silence between them more comfortable now, less weighted with uncertainty. Through the window, the sun was setting over the red rocks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too vivid to be real. Evelyn was right about the sunsets, Clara said softly, watching the colors shift and change. They are something special. Luke followed her gaze. They are, though I'd gotten used to them, stopped really seeing them. Funny how that happens. You get so accustomed to beauty that it becomes invisible. That's the danger of familiarity, Clara agreed. Everything becomes ordinary if you look at it long enough. Is that what happened in Philadelphia? Everything became ordinary? Clara considered the question. No. Everything became gray. The buildings, the sky, the people, even the things that should have been colorful just seemed washed out. Or maybe that was just me. Just the way I was seeing things after so many years of struggle. And now? Now everything's almost too bright, Clara admitted. Too much space, too much color. It's overwhelming in a different way. Luke set down his fork. You'll adjust. Give it time. That's what I'm afraid of, Clara said before she could stop herself. That I'll adjust, that I'll start to belong here, and then I'll have to leave, and it'll hurt all over again. The words hung in the air between them, more honest than Clara had intended. Luke was quiet for a moment, then stood and carried his plate to the sink. Then don't leave, he said simply, his back to her. Stay longer than the growing season. Stay as long as you want. Luke, I'm not asking for anything improper, he said quickly, turning to face her. I'm just saying there's room here, for a partnership, for a friendship, for whatever this might become. You don't have to have it all figured out right now. Clara stood as well, gathering her own plate. What did you think would happen when Evelyn arrived? What were you expecting from this arrangement? Luke leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Honestly, I didn't think much beyond the basics. A wife, a partner, someone to share the work and the life. Maybe children eventually, but it was all theoretical, all based on letters and imagination. I didn't really know her, Clara. I didn't know either of you. And now you know me, Clara said. Or you're starting to. Isn't that stranger than what you planned? More complicated? Definitely more complicated, Luke agreed with a slight smile. But maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe real is better than imagined, even when it's messy. They washed the dishes together, falling into an easy rhythm. Clara washing, Luke drying and putting away. It was domestic and ordinary, and somehow more intimate than any of the grand gestures Clara had read about in books. When the dishes were done, Luke excused himself to check on the cattle, leaving Clara alone in the kitchen. She found herself wandering through the house, taking in details she'd been too overwhelmed to notice before. Photographs on the mantel showed Luke as a boy with a stern-looking man and a gentle-faced woman, his parents, presumably. Books lined a shelf in the parlor, a mix of agricultural manuals and leather-bound novels that looked well-read. She paused at a photograph of the ranch itself, taken years ago when the paint was fresh and the fences stood straight. It had been beautiful once, full of promise. Could be again, maybe, with enough work and care. Clara was sitting on the porch when Luke returned, the last light fading from the sky. He settled into the chair beside hers, and they watched the stars emerge one by one, impossibly bright against the darkening blue. Evelyn was right about these too, Clara said, tilting her head back to take in the vast sweep of the Milky Way. You really can read by them. Almost, Luke said. On a moonless night, you can see your shadow from starlight alone. First time I noticed that, I was about 12, thought it was magic. Maybe it is, Clara said softly. They sat in companionable silence, the night sounds of the desert rising around them, crickets and distant coyote and the whisper of wind through sage. Clara felt something loosening in her chest, some tight knot of anxiety that had been there so long she'd forgotten it wasn't permanent. Luke? She said after a while. Thank you. For giving me a chance, for not sending me away. He turned to look at her, his face barely visible in the starlight. Thank you for coming, for telling the truth, even when it was hard, for keeping your promise to Evelyn. Clara felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back. I miss her. Even though it's only been months, I miss her so much sometimes I can't breathe. Tell me about her, Luke said. Not the woman from the letters. The real Evelyn. So Clara did. She told him about Evelyn's terrible singing voice and her habit of humming while she worked. About how she'd saved a stray cat once, nursing it back to health in their tiny apartment despite their aunt's protests. About her fear of thunderstorms and her love of cheap novels and the way she'd cried at happy endings. She was sentimental, Clara said. Everything made her cry. Sad things, happy things, beautiful things. I used to tease her about it, but secretly I envied that capacity to feel so deeply. You feel deeply, Luke said. You just show it differently. How would you know? I see it in the way you work, the care you take with small things. The way you looked at that garden today, seeing not what it was, but what it could be. That's feeling, Clara. Just a different kind. Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. They sat together until the chill of the desert night drove them inside, and Clara climbed the stairs to her temporary room, and Luke settled into his own space at the other end of the house. But lying in bed that night, Clara found sleep came easier than it had the night before. The sounds of the house were becoming familiar, the shadows less strange, and when she finally drifted off, she dreamed not of Philadelphia's gray streets, but of gardens full of growing things, of sunsets over red rocks, of a future that was still undefined but no longer quite so frightening. The next morning dawned clear and bright, perfect for the trip into town. Clara dressed carefully in her best skirt and a clean shirtwaist, pinning her hair up in a style that was practical but neat. Luke was already hitching up the wagon when she came outside, and he nodded approvingly at her appearance. You look nice, he said, then immediately looked flustered. I mean, you look ready for town. Respectable. Clara smiled at his awkwardness. Thank you. I wasn't sure what the standards were out here. Mrs. Chen will approve, and she's the closest thing Dust Valley has to a social arbiter, Luke said, helping her up onto the wagon seat. Speaking of which, I should warn you. Small town means everyone's going to be curious about you. About us. There'll be questions. What should I tell them? Luke settled beside her and picked up the reins. The truth, I suppose. That you're helping me with the ranch. That we're business partners. Anything more specific than that is nobody's business but ours. The ride into Dust Valley took about 30 minutes, the wagon jolting over ruts in the road that hadn't been graded in years. Luke pointed out landmarks as they went. The old Jensen place, abandoned after the family moved back east. The turnoff that led to the Henderson Ranch, where Luke sold most of his beef. A creek that ran full in spring but was barely a trickle now. Population's been declining, Luke explained. Mining's drying up and ranching's hard. A lot of folks gave up and left. Those of us who stayed are either too stubborn or too poor to go anywhere else. Which are you? Both, probably, Luke said with a wry smile. Dust Valley itself was larger than Clara had realized on her first brief glimpse. The main street boasted a general store, a saloon, a church, the boarding house, a blacksmith, and several other businesses that seemed to be clinging to existence through sheer determination. People were out and about despite the heat, and Clara could feel their eyes tracking the wagon as Luke drove through town. He pulled up in front of Morrison's general store, a weathered building with a false front that had once been painted red but had faded to a dusty pink. A bell jangled as they entered. and a rotund man with impressive mutton chops looked up from behind the counter. "Luke Callahan," he boomed, "twice in 1 week, and with a lady, no less. To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" "Morning, Morrison. Need to place an order for seeds and garden supplies." Luke gestured to Clara. "This is Miss Clara Harper. She'll be helping me expand the ranch's operations." Morrison's eyes went wide with undisguised curiosity, taking in every detail of Clara's appearance. "Harper, you say? Wasn't that the name of the—" "Her sister," Luke interrupted smoothly, "who unfortunately passed before she could make the journey. Miss Clara came in her place to deliver the news in person and has agreed to stay on and help with the ranch." It was a careful dance around the truth, and Clara watched Morrison processing this information, clearly trying to decide what it meant. Finally, he seemed to accept it at face value. "Well, condolences on your loss, Miss Harper," Morrison said, sounding genuinely sympathetic. "And welcome to Dust Valley. Any friend of Luke's is welcome here. Now, what kind of seeds are we talking about?" Clara stepped forward, pulling out the list she'd made the previous evening. "I'll need lettuce starts, radish seeds, green onion sets, bush beans, pole beans, tomato plants, squash seeds, both summer and winter varieties, herbs, particularly basil and dill, and seed potatoes if you have them." Morrison's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "That's quite an ambitious garden you're planning." "1/4 acre, Clara said confidently. "Properly managed, it should produce enough surplus to sell at market." "Is that so?" Morrison looked between Clara and Luke with new interest. "Well, I'll be damned. Pardon my language, miss. I've got most of what you need in stock. The tomato plants I can get from Mrs. Henderson. She starts them in her greenhouse. When do you need everything?" "As soon as possible," Luke said. "We're trying to catch the tail end of the growing season." Morrison nodded and began pulling items from shelves and drawers, stacking them on the counter. As he worked, the bell jangled again, and Mrs. Chen entered, her small frame wrapped in a dark blue dress despite the heat. "Mr. Callahan," she said with a slight nod. Then her eyes found Clara. "And you must be the young lady from the train. I am Mrs. Chen. I run the boarding house." Clara offered her hand. "Clara Harper. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Chen." Mrs. Chen took her hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Your sister was the one who was supposed to arrive, yes? I am sorry for your loss." "Thank you," Clara said, appreciating the directness. "And now you are staying at Mr. Callahan's ranch?" Mrs. Chen's tone was carefully neutral, but Clara could hear the question beneath the words. "I'm helping with ranch operations," Clara said, meeting the older woman's gaze steadily. "Managing a commercial garden. It's strictly a business arrangement." Mrs. Chen studied her for a long moment, then nodded as if Clara had passed some invisible test. "If you need anything at all, you come to the boarding house. I have a spare room if you ever wish for different accommodations." It was an offer of refuge, Clara realized. A lifeline in case Luke's hospitality became something other than what it was supposed to be. She felt a rush of gratitude for this woman who barely knew her but was already looking out for her welfare. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. I'll remember that." Morrison had finished gathering the supplies, and the total came to $18.40, just under the budget Clara had estimated. Luke paid without hesitation, and Morrison promised to have the tomato plants delivered by end of week. As they loaded the supplies into the wagon, a young woman approached, her blonde hair pinned up in an elaborate style that seemed out of place in Dust Valley's dusty simplicity. She was pretty in a conventional way, with blue eyes and a heart-shaped face, but there was something calculating in her expression. "Luke," she said, her voice carrying a slight southern lilt. "I haven't seen you in weeks. Where have you been hiding yourself?" Luke's posture shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. "Been busy with the ranch, Sarah. You know how it is." Sarah's eyes slid to Clara, assessing and finding something wanting. "And who's this?" "Clara Harper," Luke said. "She's helping with the ranch. Clara, this is Sarah Mitchell. Her father owns the saloon." Sarah's smile didn't reach her eyes. "How fascinating. I didn't realize you were hiring help, Luke. I thought you always said you couldn't afford it." "It's a partnership," Clara said coolly, not liking the proprietary way Sarah was looking at Luke. "I'm managing agricultural expansion in exchange for a share of the profit." "How modern," Sarah said, making the word sound like an insult. Well, I do hope you'll both come to the church social next Sunday. We wouldn't want people to get the wrong idea about your arrangement. It was a clear insinuation, and Clara felt her temper flare. But before she could respond, Luke placed a gentle hand on her elbow. "We'll think about it," he said to Sarah. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we've got work to get back to." He helped Clara up onto the wagon seat and climbed up beside her, taking the reins. Sarah stood watching them, her expression unreadable, as they pulled away. "Old friend?" Clara asked once they were out of earshot. Luke's jaw was tight. "Sarah and I courted briefly a few years back. It didn't work out. She wasn't interested in a struggling rancher, and I wasn't interested in a woman who saw me as a stepping stone to something better. She set her sights on the mine owner's son after that, but he left for San Francisco, and she's been looking for alternatives ever since." "And you're an alternative?" "I own land," Luke said flatly. "In Sarah's world, that makes me a viable option, especially now that better prospects have dried up. But I learned my lesson. I'm not interested in being anyone's second choice or convenient solution." Clara absorbed this, understanding more about Luke's decision to seek a mail-order bride. He'd wanted someone who chose him deliberately, not someone who settled for him out of limited options. They rode in silence for a while, the wagon bed full of seeds and possibilities. Finally, Clara spoke. "For what it's worth, I don't think you're anyone's second choice. I think you're exactly what you are, a good man trying to build something worthwhile in difficult circumstances." Luke glanced at her, surprise and something softer in his expression. "That might be the nicest thing anyone said to me in years." "Then people haven't been paying attention," Clara said. When they reached the ranch, they unloaded the supplies together, storing the seeds in the cool darkness of the root cellar. The afternoon stretched ahead of them, full of work and possibility, and Clara found herself actually looking forward to it, to the physical labor, to the satisfaction of planting something and watching it grow, to the quiet companionship of working alongside someone who understood the value of effort. As the sun climbed toward its zenith and they headed out to the garden with tools and seeds in hand, Clara realized something that made her heart skip. She wasn't counting the days until she could leave anymore. She was counting the days until she could see the first sprouts breaking through the soil, until the garden she was planting would begin to bear fruit. She was, against all her expectations and better judgment, beginning to put down roots in West Valley. And the most surprising part was that it didn't terrify her quite as much as it should have. The seeds went into the ground over the next 3 days, each one placed with deliberate care in soil that Clara and Luke had spent hours preparing. They worked from dawn until the heat became unbearable, then resumed in the cooler evening hours, their shadows stretching long across the freshly turned earth. Clara's hands developed new blisters that sat alongside the old ones, but she didn't complain. There was something deeply satisfying about this work, about creating order from chaos, about the promise contained in each tiny seed. On the fourth morning, Clara woke to find Luke already in the garden, standing motionless among the rows they'd planted. She threw a shawl over her nightgown and hurried outside, her bare feet gathering dust. "What's wrong?" she called as she approached. Luke turned, and his face was lit with something between wonder and disbelief. "Look," he said, pointing. Clara followed his gaze and saw them, tiny green shoots pushing through the soil in the radish rows, each one a small miracle of determination. The seeds they'd planted just 3 days ago were already reaching toward the sun. "They're early," Clara breathed, kneeling to examine the delicate sprouts. "The soil must be better than I thought, and with this heat, the germination time shortened." "It's working," Luke said, and there was something in his voice Clara had never heard before. Pure, uncomplicated hope. "Your plan is actually working." Clara stood, brushing dirt from her nightgown, suddenly aware of how improper she must look. But Luke wasn't looking at her state of dress. He was looking at the garden, at the evidence of growth, at the possibility of change. "It's too early to celebrate," Clara warned, though she couldn't keep the smile from her face. "These are just sprouts. We need to see them through to harvest, need to make sure the market will buy what we're selling, need to—" "Clara," Luke interrupted gently, "let yourself be happy about this, just for a minute." So she did. She stood beside him in the early morning light, watching the sun paint the red rocks gold, and let herself feel the small triumph of seeds becoming plants. It wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, but it was something. It was a beginning. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt almost natural. Clara would wake before dawn and start coffee, and Luke would come down from checking the cattle to find breakfast waiting. They'd work the garden together in the cool morning hours. Then Luke would tend to ranch business while Clara managed the house and prepared meals. In the evenings, they'd return to the garden, or sit on the porch and talk, or simply exist in comfortable silence while the desert sky performed its nightly color show. It was domestic and routine and utterly different from anything Clara had known in Philadelphia. There, every day had been a struggle for survival, every moment calculated for maximum efficiency. Here, there was still hard work, still uncertainty about the future, but there was also space to breathe, space to think, space to become someone other than the woman she'd been forced to be by circumstance. On Sunday, a week and a half after Clara's arrival, Luke brought up the church social over breakfast. "We don't have to go," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "I know Sarah put us in an awkward position, but if we don't show up, people will talk even more than they already are." Clara set down her coffee cup. "What are they saying?" Luke shifted uncomfortably. "Morrison's wife has a sister who works at the boarding house. According to Mrs. Chen, the general consensus is that we're either engaged in something scandalous, or I've hired you under false pretenses, or you're secretly Evelyn pretending to be someone else for nefarious purposes." "That last one is oddly specific," Clara said. "Small towns breed creative gossip," Luke said with a wry smile. "The truth, that we're business partners, and you're staying in the guest room while we figure things out, is apparently too boring to consider." Clara thought about this. She'd known there would be talk, had expected it, but hearing the speculation laid out so plainly made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to go to the social. Let people see that we're respectable, that there's nothing untoward happening. I want to introduce you properly to the community. Let them see you as a person rather than a mystery to speculate about." Luke paused. "But only if you're comfortable with it. I won't force you into something that makes you uneasy." Clara considered her options. She could hide at the ranch, avoid the scrutiny, let the gossip continue unchecked, or she could face it head on, show Dust Valley that she had nothing to be ashamed of. "We'll go," she decided, "but on one condition." "What's that?" "You teach me to dance. If there's going to be dancing, I don't want to embarrass either of us. It's been years since I danced with anyone, and I was never particularly good at it." Luke's expression softened. "I'm not much of a dancer myself, but I can manage a basic waltz. We could practice this evening if you'd like." That evening, after the dishes were washed and the sun had begun its descent, Luke pushed the kitchen table against the wall to clear a space. He stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, looking uncertain. "I should warn you," he said. "I haven't done this since my mother made me practice with her when I was 16. I'm likely to step on your feet." "Then we'll be evenly matched," Clara said, trying to ignore the flutter of nervousness in her stomach. Luke held out his hand and Clara took it. His other hand settled lightly on her waist, and she placed her free hand on his shoulder. They stood like that for a moment, both suddenly aware of how close they were, how intimate this simple position felt. "Right," Luke said, clearing his throat. "So the waltz is a 3 count, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. I'll lead. That means I step forward on 1, you step back. Then we move together for 2 and 3. Ready?" Clara nodded, and Luke began to count. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. They moved through the kitchen in awkward, halting steps. Luke did indeed step on Clara's foot twice in the first minute, and she accidentally kicked his shin. But gradually, painfully, they found a rhythm. Luke's counting became softer, less necessary, and Clara began to anticipate his movement. "You're getting it," Luke said, and Clara realized he was smiling, a real smile, unguarded and genuine. "So are you," she replied. They continued dancing even after they'd mastered the basic steps, moving in slow circles around the kitchen while twilight deepened outside the window. There was no music except the sound of their breathing and the soft scuff of feet on floorboards, but it didn't matter. This wasn't about the dancing anymore. It was about trust, about learning to move together, about the strange intimacy of matched rhythms and shared space. When they finally stopped, both slightly breathless, Clara became aware that Luke's hand was still on her waist, that she was still holding his hand. They stood frozen in the dancing position, and Clara could feel her heart hammering against her ribs. "Clara," Luke said softly, and there was something in his voice that made her look up. His eyes were dark in the fading light, fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, and she wasn't sure if she wanted him to or if she was terrified of what it might mean if he did. But then Luke stepped back, releasing her, and the moment shattered like glass. "We should probably get some rest," he said, his voice rough. "Long day tomorrow, getting ready for the social." Clara nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She fled upstairs to her room and sat on the edge of the bed, her hand pressed to her racing heart. This was becoming complicated in ways she hadn't anticipated, in ways she wasn't prepared for. She'd come here to deliver a message and leave. Then she'd stayed to tend a garden, a simple business arrangement with clear boundaries. But boundaries were harder to maintain when you danced in a kitchen at twilight, when you worked side by side in the soil, when you sat on a porch and shared stories about the people you used to be. Boundaries required distance, and distance was becoming impossible. Sunday arrived too quickly. Clara dressed with care in the one good dress she owned, a deep blue cotton with modest lace at the collar and cuffs. It had been Evelyn's, altered to fit Clara's slightly taller frame, and wearing it felt like carrying her sister with her. She pinned her hair up carefully, allowing a few soft curls to frame her face, and studied her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. She looked nervous. She looked like a woman about to walk into a room full of strangers who'd already formed opinions about her. She looked, she realized with some surprise, like someone who cared what those strangers thought. Luke was waiting downstairs in a suit that had clearly been pulled from the back of a wardrobe, slightly moth-eaten but clean and pressed. He'd shaved carefully, and his hair was slicked back with pomade. When he saw Clara descending the stairs, something flickered across his face too quickly for her to identify. "You look lovely," he said simply. "You clean up well yourself," Clara replied, managing a smile. The church was a white clapboard building at the edge of town, and the social was being held in the adjoining hall. They could hear music and laughter from a block away, and Clara felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. Luke must have sensed it because he offered his arm. "We'll stay for an hour," he said quietly. "Show our faces, dance once or twice, then we can leave, all right?" Clara nodded and took his arm, grateful for the solid warmth of him beside her. The hall was decorated with bunting and paper lanterns, and what looked like the entire population of Dust Valley was crammed inside. A small band, fiddle, guitar, and accordion, was playing in one corner, and couples were dancing in the cleared center space. Tables laden with food lined one wall, and groups of people clustered everywhere, talking and laughing. Their entrance didn't go unnoticed. Conversations faltered as people turned to look, and Clara felt the weight of dozens of eyes assessing her. She lifted her chin and kept her expression neutral, refusing to show how intimidating this was. Mrs. Chen appeared almost immediately, cutting through the crowd with determined efficiency. "Mr. Callahan, Miss Harper, I'm glad you came." She lowered her voice. "Ignore the stares. Give them something else to talk about, and they will forget their speculation." "Easier said than done," Luke murmured. "Then make it easy," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "Dance, eat, be seen enjoying yourselves. Show them you have nothing to hide." She patted Clara's hand. "You will be fine. You are stronger than you think." Mrs. Chen melted back into the crowd, leaving them standing at the edge of the festivities. Luke looked at Clara questioningly. "Might as well get it over with," Clara said with more bravery than she felt. Luke led her to the dance floor just as a waltz began. Clara recognized the 3 count immediately and felt a flutter of relief. At least this was something they'd practiced. Luke's hand found her waist, her hand found his shoulder, and they began to move. It was different than dancing in the kitchen. Here, there were other couples to navigate around, music to follow, and the awareness of being watched by half the town. But the steps were the same, and Clara found herself relaxing into the familiar rhythm. Luke was a better dancer than he'd claimed, guiding her smoothly through the turns, and Clara realized she was actually enjoying this. "You're full of surprises," she said as they swept past the band. "So are you," Luke replied. "I was expecting you to be terrified." I am terrified, Clara admitted. I'm just good at hiding it. Luke's hand tightened slightly on her waist, a gesture of reassurance, of solidarity. We're in this together, remember? Partners. The waltz ended, and they were immediately approached by Martha Yates, the schoolteacher Clara had seen on the train. Mr. Callahan, you must introduce me properly to your companion, Martha said with a warm smile. We only saw each other briefly at the station. Luke made the introductions, and Martha's eyes lit with genuine interest as Clara explained about the garden project. How wonderful, Martha exclaimed. We desperately need fresh produce in this town. The only vegetables we get are whatever Morrison can keep from spoiling on the journey from Silver Creek. If you could provide local options, you'd have customers lining up. Other people began to drift over, drawn by Martha's enthusiasm. The blacksmith, Jacob Miller, wanted to know if Clara would have tomatoes for his wife's canning. The assay office owner, Thomas Reynolds, asked about herbs for his wife's cooking. Even Morrison approached, looking slightly sheepish. My wife wanted me to ask, he said, if you might consider selling at the Saturday market once you've got produce ready. We could use some local suppliers. Clara felt something loosening in her chest as she answered questions, discussed planting schedules, and took mental notes on what the community needed most. These people weren't judging her, they were welcoming her. Seeing her not as a scandal or a mystery, but as someone who might actually contribute something valuable to their struggling town. Sarah Mitchell watched from across the room, her expression unreadable. She was surrounded by a cluster of young women, all whispering behind their hands, and Clara could feel their eyes on her like pinpricks. But she refused to let their scrutiny dim the small triumph of this moment. Luke had been pulled away by Jacob Miller to discuss some ranch business, leaving Clara temporarily alone near the refreshment table. She was reaching for a glass of lemonade when Sarah materialized beside her. You've certainly made an impression, Sarah said, her voice carrying false sweetness. Everyone's quite taken with your little garden project. It's not a project, Clara said evenly. It's a business venture. Sarah's smile sharpened. Of course it is. How silly of you. She paused, studying Clara with calculating eyes. You know, I can't help but wonder about the timing of all this. Luke spends months writing to one woman, and then you show up instead. It's all very convenient. Clara felt anger flare in her chest, but kept her voice level. My sister died, Miss Mitchell. There's nothing convenient about that. No, I suppose not, Sarah agreed, not sounding sorry at all. But you have to admit it worked out rather well for you. A roof over your head, a share in a ranch, and Luke Callahan all to yourself. Some might say you planned it that way. Some people will say anything to make themselves feel important, Claire replied, meeting Sarah's gaze steadily. But the truth is rarely as interesting as the lies people prefer to believe. Sarah's eyes flashed. You think you're so clever, don't you? Coming here with your tragic story and your business arrangement? But I know Luke Callahan, Miss Harper. I know what kind of man he is, and I know he's too honorable to see when he's being taken advantage of. Then you don't know him as well as you think, Clara said. Because Luke Callahan is perfectly capable of making his own decisions. He doesn't need you to protect him from me. And he certainly doesn't need your opinion on how he runs his ranch. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but Luke appeared at Clara's elbow, 2 glasses of lemonade in hand. Sarah, he said with cold politeness, enjoying the social? Sarah's expression smoothed into artificial pleasantness. Of course, Luke, I was just getting to know your house guests better. Business partner, Luke corrected firmly. And I think Clara and I have made our rounds. We should be heading back to the ranch. He handed Clara one of the lemonade glasses and placed his other hand on the small of her back, a possessive gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Sarah or the watching crowd. Clara drank the lemonade quickly, using it to cool the anger still burning in her throat. They made their goodbyes to Mrs. Chen and Martha Yates, thanked the organizers, and slipped out into the night. The music and laughter faded behind them as they walked toward the wagon, and Clara felt the tension she'd been holding finally released. I'm sorry about Sarah, Luke said once they were settled on the wagon seat, and she had no right to speak to you that way. She's protecting her territory, Clara said, or what she thinks should be her territory. I understand the impulse, even if I don't like the execution. Luke was quiet for a moment as he guided the horses onto the road home. There is no territory. Sarah and I, that was over years ago. She made her choice, and I made mine. She doesn't get to decide now that she made a mistake. Does she know that? She should, Luke said. I've never given her reason to think otherwise. They rode in silence for a while, the stars bright overhead and the desert air cool against their skin. Clara replayed the evening in her mind, the dancing, the conversations, Sarah's veiled accusations. It had been exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. Thank you for defending me, Clara said finally. You didn't have to make such a public statement. Yes, I did, Luke said firmly. People needed to know where I stand, where we stand. And where is that exactly? Luke turned to look at her, his face shadowed in the starlight. Honestly, I'm still figuring that out, but I know I don't regret you being here. I know the ranch feels more like a home with you in it, and I know that whatever this is between us, it's not what I expected, but it's not wrong either. Clara's heart was hammering again, the way it had when they danced in the kitchen. Luke, you don't have to say anything, he interrupted gently. I'm not asking for promises or commitments. I just wanted you to know that you're welcome here, not as a replacement for Evelyn, not as a convenient solution to labor problems, but as yourself, as Clara. The words settled over her like a blanket, warm and comforting and terrifying all at once, because somewhere in the past 2 weeks, without quite meaning to, Clara had started to care about this place, and this man, and this impossible situation they'd created together. And caring meant the possibility of loss, and loss was something Clara had experienced too much of already. But sitting beside Luke on the wagon, watching the familiar shape of the ranch emerge from the darkness, Clara realized that maybe the risk was worth it. Maybe some things were worth the possibility of pain. Maybe Evelyn had been right all along. That sometimes you had to leap into the unknown and trust that solid ground would appear beneath your feet. The following weeks passed in a blur of growth and change. The garden flourished beyond Clara's most optimistic projections. The radishes were ready to harvest within 3 weeks, fat and crisp and perfect. The lettuce came in thick and green. The beans climbed their poles with vigorous determination. And the tomato plants that Mrs. Henderson had delivered were already heavy with developing fruit. Clara harvested the first radishes on a Wednesday morning, washing them carefully and bundling them with twine. Luke watched with undisguised pride as she arranged them in a basket. Morrison said to bring them by the store on Friday, Clara said. He thinks he can sell them easily. We should take them to the Saturday market instead, Luke suggested. Cut out the middleman, keep more of the profit. So that Saturday, they loaded the wagon with radishes, lettuce, and the first of the green onions. Clara had stayed up late the night before making signs with prices, and Luke had built a simple display table from scrapwood. They set up at the edge of the market, which was little more than a dusty square where local sellers hawked everything from eggs to hand-sewn quilts. Clara had been nervous about whether anyone would buy from an unknown seller, but within the first hour they'd sold half their stock. People were hungry for fresh vegetables, and the quality of Clara's produce spoke for itself. By noon, everything was gone, and Clara's pockets held more money than she'd seen in months. We did it, she said, counting the coins for the third time to make sure she hadn't miscalculated. Luke, we actually did it. Luke was grinning like a fool. You did it. This was all your plan, your knowledge, your hard work. Our hard work, Clara corrected. Partners, remember? They split the profits 50-50 as agreed, and Luke insisted on taking Clara to the boarding house for lunch to celebrate. Mrs. Chen served them her famous dumplings and tea, and they ate while discussing expansion plans, more rows, different crops, maybe even a small greenhouse for winter growing. You're thinking long-term, Luke observed, watching Clara sketch ideas on a napkin. Clara paused, pen hovering over paper. Is that a problem? No, Luke said softly. It's perfect. It means you're staying. Clara met his eyes across the table. It means I'm considering staying, past the growing season, if the arrangement still works for both of us. It works for me, Luke said immediately. More than works. You've brought this place back to life, Clara. Not just the garden, but all of it. The house feels like a home again. The ranch has direction. I have... He stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. I have a partner I can count on. Clara felt warmth spread through her chest, a feeling that was becoming familiar whenever Luke looked at her like this, like she was something valuable, something worth keeping. That evening, they sat on the porch, as had become their custom, watching the sunset paint the red rocks in shades of fire. Clara had brought out the ledger she'd been keeping, tracking expenses and profits from the garden. "We're ahead of projections," she said, running her finger down the columns. "If the tomatoes and squash do as well as I expect, we'll turn a significant profit this season. Enough to expand operations next year, maybe even hire some help." Luke leaned over to look at the ledger, and his shoulder brushed hers. Neither of them moved away. "You have a gift for this," Luke said. "Not just the growing, but the business side. You see angles I'd never considered. My father used to say that farming was 10% dirt and 90% thinking," Clara said. "You have to be strategic, plan ahead, anticipate problems before they arise." "Is that what you're doing now? Anticipating problems?" Clara closed the ledger slowly. I'm trying to figure out what happens when the growing season ends. Whether this arrangement can sustain itself through winter. Whether..." She stopped, uncertain how to finish. "Whether we can sustain ourselves," Luke said quietly. "That's what you're really asking, isn't it?" Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. Luke was silent for a long moment, his eyes on the distant mountains. "I think about Evelyn sometimes," he said finally. "About what it would have been like if she'd been the one to step off that train. And the truth is, I can't really imagine it anymore. When I try to picture my life, my future, the person I see standing in the garden, sitting on this porch, the person I see is you." Clara's breath caught. "Luke, I'm not asking you to be her replacement," Luke continued, his voice steady. "I'm not asking you to be anything other than who you are, but I am asking if you might consider staying permanently. Not as hired help, not as a business partner, but as..." He paused, searching for words. "As whatever you want to be, whatever we might become." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "I don't know what I want to be. I came here thinking I was keeping a promise, doing one last thing for Evelyn, and then I'd leave and start over somewhere else. But now I can't imagine leaving. Can't imagine not seeing this garden through another season, not watching the ranch grow, not sitting on this porch and watching the sunsets with you." "Then don't imagine it," Luke said, turning to face her fully. "Don't leave. Stay and we'll figure out the rest as we go." "What will people say?" "What they're already saying," Luke said with a slight smile. "The difference is, we'll know the truth. That this isn't scandal or convenience or any of the things they want to believe. It's just two people who found something unexpected and decided it was worth holding on to." Clara looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not the stranger from the letters, but the man who'd emerged through weeks of shared work and quiet conversation. He wasn't what she'd expected when she'd boarded that train. He was better, more real, more thoroughly himself than any imagined ideal could have been. "I have conditions," she said finally. Luke's expression turned serious. "Name them." "We continue as partners. Equal say in ranch decisions, equal share in profits. I won't be dependent on anyone's charity or goodwill ever again." "Agreed." "We take things slowly. No promises we can't keep, no assumptions about the future. We let this develop naturally, whatever it becomes." "Agreed." "And if it doesn't work, if we realize we've made a mistake, we part as friends. No bitterness, no regret. Just two people who tried something and it didn't work out." Luke extended his hand. "Agreed, though I don't think we're making a mistake." Clara took his hand, and this time the handshake felt different. Less like a business arrangement and more like a promise. "Neither do I, but I've learned not to trust my judgment when it comes to hope." "Then trust mine," Luke said, still holding her hand. "Trust that I see something here worth building on. Trust that you're not alone in this uncertainty." Clara realized he was still holding her hand, that neither of them had let go. His palm was warm and calloused against hers, solid and real and present. And in that moment, with the last light fading from the sky and the first stars beginning to appear, Clara let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this impossible situation might actually work. "I'll stay," she said softly. "Through winter, through next spring, through whatever comes. I'll stay and we'll see where this goes." Luke's smile was brilliant, transforming his face. "That's all I'm asking. He released her hand then, but the warmth of his touch lingered. They sat together as night fell completely, watching the stars emerge one by one, and Clara felt something shift inside her, a wall coming down, a door opening, a possibility taking root and beginning to grow. The garden had been her excuse to stay. The partnership had been her rationalization. But sitting here with Luke, feeling the rightness of this moment, Clara acknowledged the truth she'd been avoiding. She was falling for him. Slowly, carefully, against all her better judgment and protective instincts, she was letting herself fall. And instead of terrifying her, it felt like coming home. The first real test of their new understanding came 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday that started like any other. Clara was in the garden harvesting tomatoes when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching at speed. She straightened, shading her eyes against the morning sun, and saw a rider she didn't recognize tearing up the road toward the ranch house. Luke emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, his expression immediately wary. Riders who came at that speed rarely brought good news. The man pulled his horse to a skidding stop, dust billowing around them. He was young, barely 20, with the Henderson Ranch brand on his vest. "Mr. Callahan," he panted. "Mr. Henderson sent me. There's been an accident at the mine. Cave-in. They're asking for anyone who can help with the digging." Luke's face went pale. "How many trapped?" "At least 6 that they know of, maybe more." The young man's voice cracked. "My brother's down there, sir. Please. We need every hand we can get." "I'll saddle up," Luke said immediately, already moving toward the barn. Then he stopped, turning back to Clara. "I might be gone all day, all night even. Can you?" "I'll manage the ranch," Clara said firmly. "Go. They need you." Luke nodded, gratitude and worry warring in his expression. Within minutes, he'd saddled Cassie and was riding hard toward town alongside the Henderson rider. Clara watched until they disappeared from view, then turned to survey the ranch with new eyes. For the first time since her arrival, she was completely alone here, completely responsible for everything. The morning passed in a blur of activity. Clara fed the chickens, checked the cattle in the near pasture, brought in water from the well. She harvested more tomatoes because they couldn't wait, weeded the bean rows because it needed doing, and tried not to think about men trapped in darkness beneath tons of rock. By afternoon, she'd run out of immediate tasks and found herself pacing the porch, unable to settle. What if Luke was hurt helping with the rescue? What if the mine collapsed further? What if he didn't come back? The last thought stopped her cold. When had Luke become so essential to her sense of security? When had this place, this life, become something she couldn't imagine losing? She was still wrestling with these questions when she heard a wagon approaching. This time it was Mrs. Chen, her small figure perched on the driver's seat with surprising command. "Miss Harper," Mrs. Chen called as she pulled up. "I thought you might appreciate company, and I brought supplies." She gestured to several baskets in the wagon bed. "The women are organizing. Food for the rescue workers, bandages, whatever might be needed. I thought you and I could prepare things here, then take them to the mine." Clara felt a rush of gratitude. "Thank you. I was going mad with waiting and not knowing." Mrs. Chen climbed down with practiced ease. "Waiting is harder than doing, so we will do." They worked together in the kitchen, Clara following Mrs. Chen's efficient directions. They made sandwiches, strong coffee, prepared clean cloths that could serve as bandages. Mrs. Chen moved through Luke's kitchen as if she knew it, and Clara realized she probably did, had probably helped Luke's mother in this same space years ago. "You care for him," Mrs. Chen said after a while. It wasn't a question. Clara's hand stilled on the bread she was slicing. "Is it that obvious?" "To someone who knows what to look for, yes." Mrs. Chen began packing sandwiches into a basket with methodical precision. "He cares for you too. I have known Luke Callahan since he was a boy. I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." "Not even Sarah Mitchell?" Mrs. Chen made a dismissive sound. "Sarah Mitchell wants a husband who will give her status and security. She never saw Luke, only what he could provide. You see him. That is the difference." Clara absorbed this, trying to sort through the tangle of her feelings. "I didn't come here for this. For him. I came to deliver a message and leave." "And yet you stayed," Mrs. Chen observed. "Why?" "At first for the garden, for the work, for the purpose it gave me. Clara set down the knife, meeting Mrs. Chen's knowing gaze. But now I'm not sure I could leave even if I wanted to, and that terrifies me. Love often does, Mrs. Chen said matter-of-factly. It requires trust, and trust requires courage. But I think you are more brave than you believe, Miss Harper. You traveled across a continent alone. You faced a stranger with difficult news. You built something from nothing in hostile ground. These are not the actions of a coward. But what if I'm wrong? What if this is just loneliness and proximity, and I'm mistaking it for something more? Mrs. Chen's expression softened. Then you will discover that in time, and you will adjust. But I do not think you are wrong. I think you have found something rare, a partnership built on honesty and respect. The affection that grows from such soil tends to be sturdy. They finished the preparations in companionable silence, then loaded the wagon. The ride to the mine took nearly an hour, the road rough and climbing steadily into the foothills. They could see the mine entrance from a distance, a dark mouth in the hillside, surrounded by a haphazard collection of buildings and equipment. People swarmed around it like ants, and even from here Clara could hear shouting. The scene at the mine was controlled chaos. Men covered in dust and sweat worked in shifts, hauling rock and timber from the collapsed tunnel. Women tended a makeshift medical station, and children ran errands, carrying water and messages. Mrs. Chen directed Clara to set up their supplies near the medical area, and Clara scanned the crowd frantically for Luke. She found him finally, emerging from the mine entrance with another man, both of them supporting a third between them. The rescued miner was conscious but limping badly, his face streaked with blood and dirt. Luke's shirt was torn, his hands scraped raw, but he was whole and moving and alive. Relief hit Clara so hard her knees nearly buckled. She steadied herself against the wagon and watched as Luke and his companion delivered the injured man to the medical station. Luke looked exhausted, his face drawn with strain, but when he turned and caught sight of Clara, his expression transformed. He crossed to her in long strides, and Clara met him halfway without thinking. "You're all right," she said, and her voice came out shaky. "I'm fine," Luke assured her, though his hands were trembling slightly from exertion. "We got 4 out so far, 2 more still trapped, but we know where they are now. It's just a matter of clearing the debris." Clara wanted to touch him, to reassure herself of his solidity, but they were surrounded by half the town. Instead, she gestured to the supplies. "Mrs. Chen and I brought food and coffee. You should eat something." "In a minute, I need to—" Luke stopped, really looking at her for the first time. "You came." "Of course I came. I couldn't just stay at the ranch not knowing if you were—" Clara caught herself, aware of listening ears. "We wanted to help." Something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. Luke reached out as if to touch her face, then seemed to remember where they were, and dropped his hand. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything. For managing the ranch. For coming here. For—" "Luke!" someone shouted. "We need you back in the tunnel!" Luke closed his eyes briefly, frustration and duty warring in his expression. "I have to go. But Clara—" He paused, searching for words. "Be careful getting home. The road's dangerous in the dark." "We will," Clara promised. "You be careful in there." Luke nodded and turned back toward the mine, but not before Clara saw the look in his eyes. A look that said everything they couldn't speak aloud in this public place. The rescue continued into the night. Clara and Mrs. Chen worked tirelessly, serving food, bandaging minor injuries, offering comfort where they could. Clara learned that one of the trapped miners was Joseph Henderson, the ranch owner's youngest son, which explained why so many people had turned out to help. The other was a newcomer to town, a man named Patrick, who'd only been working the mine for a month. Around midnight, a cheer went up from the crowd. They'd reached Joseph Henderson, and he was alive. Battered and with a badly broken leg, but alive. His father wept openly as they carried him out, and his mother collapsed in relief. But Patrick was still trapped, buried deeper than Joseph had been, and the tunnel was unstable. The mine foreman called a halt to the digging, declaring it too dangerous to continue. Luke emerged from a heated discussion with the foreman, his face set in stubborn lines. Clara knew that look. She'd seen it when he'd decided she should stay at the ranch. when he defended her to Sarah Mitchell. It was the look of a man who'd made up his mind and wouldn't be swayed. "They want to abandon him," Luke said to Jacob Miller, the blacksmith, his voice carrying enough that Clara could hear. "Leave him down there and seal the tunnel." "It's not safe, Luke," Jacob said, though he looked troubled. "The whole thing could come down. The foreman's right to call it." "There's a man alive down there," Luke said flatly. "I heard him calling out 20 minutes ago. I won't leave him to die in the dark." "You can't go back in alone," Jacob protested. "Then come with me." Jacob looked at the mine entrance, at his wife standing near the medical station with their 2 children, and Clara saw the moment he made his decision. "All right, but we do this smart and we do it quick. If it starts to collapse, we run." Clara's heart was in her throat as she watched Luke and Jacob gather equipment, lanterns, rope, wooden braces. She wanted to scream at him not to go, to let someone else risk their life, but she knew it would be useless. This was who Luke was, someone who wouldn't abandon people who needed help, even when it cost him. Mrs. Chen appeared at Clara's elbow. "You cannot stop him," she said quietly, "so do not waste energy trying." "I know," Clara said, her voice barely audible. "But if something happens, then you will survive it, as you have survived other losses," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "But nothing will happen. Luke Callahan is stubborn and careful in equal measure. He will come back." Clara wanted to believe her, but belief felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. She stood frozen as Luke and Jacob entered the mine, their lantern light growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely. The waiting was agony. Minutes stretched into eternity. Other miners stood near the entrance, ready to mount a rescue if needed, but their faces were grim. Everyone knew the risks. Everyone understood what Luke and Jacob had undertaken. Clara found herself praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, making bargains she had no authority to make. "Let him live, and I'll leave if that's what's best. Let him live, and I'll stay forever if that's what he wants. Let him live, and I'll tell him everything I've been too afraid to say." 20 minutes passed, 30. The crowd had grown silent, everyone straining to hear something, anything from below. And then, voices, faint at first, then growing stronger. Luke's voice, shouting instructions, Jacob responding. And a third voice, weak but present. They emerged from the darkness like figures from a dream, Luke and Jacob supporting Patrick between them, all 3 covered in dust that made them look like ghosts. Patrick was conscious but clearly in pain. His breathing labored, but he was alive. The crowd erupted in cheers. People rushed forward to help, to embrace the rescuers, to celebrate this small victory against the mountain's cruelty. But Clara stood rooted to her spot, relief and anger and love surging through her in equal measure. Luke handed Patrick off to the medical team and stood swaying slightly, exhausted beyond measure. His eyes found Clara across the crowd, and something in his expression made her move. She crossed to him without caring who saw, without caring what they thought. When she reached him, she did what she'd wanted to do since the moment she'd seen him emerge from the mine. She threw her arms around him. Luke stiffened in surprise for a moment. Then his arms came up to hold her, and Clara felt him sag against her, finally allowing himself to feel the weight of what he'd just done. "You idiot," Clara whispered against his shoulder. "You brave, stupid, wonderful idiot." "I had to," Luke said, his voice rough with dust and emotion. "I couldn't leave him." "I know," Clara said, pulling back just enough to look at his face. "I know you couldn't. But Luke, if something had happened to you..." She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the depth of the fear that had gripped her. But Luke seemed to understand anyway. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm sorry I scared you." "Don't apologize for being who you are," Clara said. "Just promise me you'll be more careful. Promise me you won't..." Her voice cracked. "Promise me you won't make me lose someone else." Luke's hands came up to frame her face, heedless of the dirt and blood on it, heedless of the crowd watching with undisguised interest. "I promise," he said. "Clara, I promise." Mrs. Chen materialized beside them, practical as always. "Mr. Callahan needs medical attention. Those hands require cleaning and bandaging. Come." Luke allowed himself to be led to the medical station, and Clara followed, not willing to let him out of her sight. She watched as Martha Yates, who had some nursing training, cleaned and bandaged his scraped palms, checked him for other injuries, and declared him bruised but fundamentally sound. "You should rest," Martha said firmly. "You've been working for nearly 20 hours straight." "I will," Luke promised, "as soon as we get home." The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Mrs. Chen had taken her wagon back to town, leaving Luke and Clara to return together. Luke drove despite his exhaustion, his bandaged hands awkward on the reins but functional. Clara sat close beside him, ostensibly because the wagon seat was narrow, but really because she needed to feel his warmth, to reassure herself that he was truly there. "The whole town will be talking by morning," Luke said after a while, a hint of amusement in his exhausted voice. "About you embracing me in front of everyone." "Let them talk," Clara said. "I don't care." "Don't you?" Clara considered this. A month ago, she would have cared desperately, would have worried about propriety and reputation and what people thought. But something had shifted in those hours of waiting, of not knowing if Luke would emerge from that mind. "No," she said finally, "I don't. Because what they think doesn't change what's true. And the truth is that I was terrified of losing you, and I'm done pretending I don't care." Luke pulled the wagon to a stop, though they were still a mile from the ranch. He turned to face her in the darkness, only the stars providing light. "Say that again," he said. "Which part?" "The part about caring." Clara's heart was racing, but she met his gaze steadily. "I care about you, Luke Callahan. More than is probably wise, more than I intended to, but I care. And seeing you risk your life tonight, I realized I can't keep hiding from that. I can't keep pretending this is just a business arrangement or a convenient partnership." "It stopped being just business the moment you stepped off that train," Luke said softly. "Maybe even before that, when I read the letters you wrote pretending to be Evelyn. There was something in those words, something real, that called to me even when I didn't know they were yours." "Luke, I'm falling in love with you, Clara," he said, the words simple and direct and utterly sincere. "I have been for weeks, maybe from the start, and I know it's complicated. I know there's Evelyn's memory between us. I know we've only known each other a short time, but standing in that mine tonight, not knowing if I'd make it out, all I could think about was you, about not getting to tell you this, about leaving you alone again after you'd already lost so much." Clara felt tears spilling down her cheeks, hot and unexpected. "You can't just say things like that." "Why not?" "Because it makes it real. Because once it's said, we can't take it back." "I don't want to take it back," Luke said. "Do you?" Clara thought about Evelyn, about the sister who'd loved this man through letters and dreams. She thought about all the reasons this was complicated, all the ways it could end badly. And then she thought about Luke emerging from the mine, about the way her heart had stopped and restarted at the sight of him, about the future she could see stretching ahead if she was brave enough to reach for it. "No," she whispered. "I don't want to take it back. I'm falling in love with you too, Luke. Against my better judgment, against all my protective instincts, I'm falling." Luke's smile was brilliant even in the darkness. He cupped her face with his bandaged hands, gentle despite the awkwardness of the wrappings, and leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. Clara didn't pull away. The kiss was soft, tentative, tasting of dust and coffee and promise. It was nothing like the kisses Clara had read about in novels. There were no fireworks, no earth-shattering revelations. It was simply Luke, solid and real and present, and it was perfect. When they pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Clara started to laugh. "What?" Luke asked, smiling despite his confusion. "I came here to deliver a letter," Clara said. "That's all I was supposed to do, deliver a letter and leave. And instead I'm sitting in a wagon in the middle of the desert, kissing a man I've known for barely a month, and it feels like the most right thing I've ever done." "Life has a way of surprising us," Luke said, taking her hand and lacing their fingers together. "Sometimes the detours are better than the planned route." They sat there for a moment longer, hands linked, before Luke picked up the reins again and guided the horses toward home. Clara leaned against his shoulder, exhaustion finally catching up with her, and felt something settle in her chest. A sense of rightness, of belonging, of finally arriving somewhere she was meant to be. The ranch house was dark when they arrived, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like home. Luke took care of the horses while Clara lit lamps and started coffee. And when he came inside, they sat at the kitchen table just holding hands, too tired for word, but not wanting to separate just yet. "What happens now?" Clara asked eventually. "Now you stay," Luke said simply. "Not as a business partner, not as a guest, but as someone building a life here. With me, if you'll have me." I thought we were taking things slowly," Clara reminded him with a slight smile. "We are," Luke said. "Slow enough to do things right. But I want you to know my intentions, Clara. I want a future with you. However long it takes to get there, whatever form it takes, I want you in it." Clara squeezed his hand. "I want that too. But Luke, there's something you should know, something I need to tell you about Evelyn, about those letters." Luke's expression grew serious. "All right." Clara took a deep breath, knowing this conversation was necessary, knowing it might change everything. "The letters I wrote after she died, they weren't all lies. Some of the feelings I wrote about, some of the hopes and dreams, they were mine as much as hers, maybe more. I think part of me was falling for you even then, even as I pretended to be her, and I felt so guilty about that, like I was betraying her memory by wanting what she couldn't have." "Clara, let me finish," she said. "I need to say this. Evelyn wanted me to stay, wanted me to have this life. She said so in her letter, but I keep wondering if she knew, if she suspected that I'd developed feelings for you through those letters, and if she did, whether her dying wish was actually a blessing or a burden." Luke was quiet for a long moment, processing this. "Do you think Evelyn would be angry?" he asked finally. "About us?" Clara considered this carefully. "No, I think she'd be happy. She loved me and she wanted me to have a good life. She wrote about you with such admiration, such hope. I think she'd be glad that something good came from all the pain." "Then let's honor her by living well," Luke said, "by building something real and honest and true. Not forgetting her, but not being imprisoned by her memory either." Clara nodded, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. "Yes, that feels right." They finished their coffee in comfortable silence, and when Clara finally stood to go upstairs, Luke stood with her. At the base of the stairs, he pulled her close for another kiss, this one deeper, more assured. "Good night, Clara," he murmured against her lips. "Good night, Luke." Clara climbed the stairs to her room, though increasingly it felt less like a guest room, more like her space in a shared home. She changed into her nightgown and lay in bed, watching moonlight paint patterns on the ceiling, and thought about how much had changed since she'd stepped off that train. She'd come to Dusk Valley carrying grief and guilt and a message she dreaded delivering. She'd expected to stay a few hours, maybe a day at most. Instead, she'd stayed weeks, then months. She'd built a garden and a business and something that looked remarkably like a future, and she'd fallen in love. It wasn't the love story Evelyn had imagined. It wasn't the fairy tale ending where the mail-order bride arrived and everything fell perfectly into place. It was messier than that, more complicated, built on a foundation of loss and deception and gradual truth. But it was real. And real, Clara was discovering, was infinitely better than imagined. The next morning, Clara woke to the smell of coffee, and something else, something sweet. She dressed quickly and hurried downstairs to find Luke in the kitchen, awkwardly attempting to flip pancakes with his bandaged hands. "You should be resting," Clara said, moving to take over. "I wanted to do something nice," Luke protested. "After everything yesterday, I wanted..." He stopped, looking sheepish. "I'm making a mess of it, aren't I?" Clara surveyed the batter-splattered stove and the slightly burnt pancakes. "A bit, but it's the thought that counts." She nudged him aside gently. "Sit. Let me finish these, and then we need to talk about those hands. The bandages need changing." They ate breakfast together, and Clara carefully unwrapped and rewrapped Luke's hands, cleaning the scrapes and applying fresh ointment. His hands were healing well, no signs of infection, but they'd be sore for days. "I need to check on the cattle," Luke said, "and the garden probably needs attention after 2 days of neglect." "The garden's fine," Clara assured him. "I managed some watering yesterday morning before the mine emergency. But Luke, you need to rest. Your body needs time to recover." "I've rested," Luke said, though the dark circles under his eyes suggested otherwise. "I can't just..." A knock at the door interrupted him. Clara answered it to find Morrison standing on the porch, looking uncomfortable. "Morning, Miss Harper. Is Luke available?" "He's here," Clara said, stepping aside to let Morrison enter. Morrison twisted his hat in his hand. "Luke, there's a town meeting this afternoon. About the mine. The foreman's recommending they close it permanently. Says it's too unstable, too dangerous. The mine owner's considering it, but it'll mean jobs lost, families leaving. We're hoping you might speak at the meeting." "Me?" Luke looked surprised. "Why me?" "Because you risked your life to save Patrick," Morrison said. "Because people respect you. Because if anyone can convince the owner to invest in proper shoring and safety measures instead of just closing down, it might be you." Luke glanced at Clara, uncertainty in his expression. She gave a small nod of encouragement. "I'll be there," Luke said, "though I'm not sure what good my words will do." Morrison's face brightened. "Your words and your example, Luke. You showed us all what it means to not give up on people. Maybe that'll remind the mine owner not to give up on this town." After Morrison left, Luke sat heavily at the table. "I don't know what to say to convince anyone of anything. I'm a rancher, not a speaker." Clara sat beside him, taking his bandaged hand carefully. "You don't need to be a speaker. You just need to be honest. Tell them why you went back into that mine. Tell them what this community means. The rest will follow." The town meeting was held in the church, the only building large enough to hold everyone. Clara sat in the back with Mrs. Chen while Luke joined the other men at the front. The mine owner, a portly man named Jacobson who lived in Silver Creek and rarely visited Dust Valley, looked supremely uncomfortable with the hostile crowd. The foreman laid out the facts. The mine was unstable, had been for months. Proper reinforcement would cost thousands of dollars. Money Jacobson didn't want to spend on a mine that was already going out. Better to cut losses, close it down, and let people find work elsewhere. "And where exactly would that be?" someone shouted from the crowd. "There's no other work within 50 miles. The meeting dissolved into chaos, everyone shouting at once. Jacobson looked ready to flee, and Clara could see the decision calcifying in his mind. Close the mine, wash his hands of Dust Valley, let the town die. Then Luke stood up. He didn't shout, didn't demand attention. He just stood there, and gradually the room quieted. People turned to look at him. This man who'd risked everything to save a stranger, who bore the bandages to prove it. "Mr. Jacobson," Luke said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "I'm not going to pretend to understand mining or business economics. I'm a rancher. I know cattle and land and how to make something grow in hostile conditions. But I know this too. Dust Valley is hostile conditions. It's hard land, harsh weather, and limited resources. Every person in this room has chosen to stay here anyway, to build lives and families in a place that fights them every step of the way." He paused, and Clara could see him gathering his thoughts, finding the words. "Yesterday, I went into an unstable mine to pull out a man I'd never met. People said it was heroic, but it wasn't. It was just refusing to give up on someone when giving up would have been easier. That's what we do here in Dust Valley. We don't give up, not on each other, not on this town, not on the future we're trying to build." Luke turned to address the whole room now, not just Jacobson. "We can't force anyone to invest in us. We can't force anyone to see value where they've decided there isn't any. But we can decide not to give up on ourselves. If the mine closes, we find other ways. We diversify, we adapt, we survive. That's what we've always done." He looked back at Jacobson. "But if you're willing to invest in proper safety measures, willing to give this mine and this town another chance, you'll find people here willing to work harder than anyone you'll find elsewhere, because this is our home. And we fight for home." The room erupted in applause. Clara felt tears streaming down her face, pride swelling in her chest. This man, this wonderful, stubborn, brave man, he understood exactly what mattered. Jacobson looked stunned, clearly not expecting this kind of response. He conferred with the foreman in urgent whispers, then stood slowly. "I'll need to review the costs," he said. "Get proper estimates for the reinforcement work. But I'll consider it. No promises, but I'll consider it." It wasn't a commitment, but it was something, more than they'd had before Luke spoke. The meeting adjourned with cautious optimism. people clustering around Luke to shake his hand, to thank him, to express hope for the first time in weeks. Clara waited until the crowd thinned before approaching. Luke saw her and smiled, exhaustion and relief evident in his expression. "You were wonderful," Clara said. "I just spoke the truth." Sometimes that's exactly what's needed. They walked home together through the afternoon heat, and Clara marveled at how natural this felt, walking beside Luke, their hands occasionally brushing, belonging to this place and these people. "Whatever Jacobson decides," Luke said as the ranch came into view, "we'll be all right. The garden's proving itself, and I've been thinking about your greenhouse idea. If we can grow through winter, we'll have income year-round." "We'll need to expand the operation for that," Clara said, her mind already working through logistics. "Maybe hire someone to help with the heavier work." "Partners," Luke said, smiling, "making plans together." "Partners," Clara agreed. "And maybe, eventually, something more." Luke stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "Clara Harper, are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks but held his gaze. "I'm suggesting that we keep building this. The ranch, the garden, us. I'm suggesting that when you're ready, when we're both ready, we make this permanent, legal, real, in every sense." "I'm ready now," Luke said immediately. "Luke, I know, slow, careful, doing things right." He took her hands gently. "But Clara, I want you to know, when you're ready, whenever that is, my answer will be yes. Enthusiastically, completely yes." Clara stood on her toes and kissed him, there in the middle of the road, not caring who might see. "Soon," she promised. "Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. When we've had time to build something so solid that nothing can shake it." "Deal," Luke said, and kissed her again. They walked the rest of the way home hand in hand, and Clara thought about Evelyn's letter, about her final wish that Clara might find in Dust Valley what she herself never could. Evelyn had wanted her to have hope, to have purpose, to have love. And Clara had found all three. Not in the way anyone had expected, not through the path that had been planned, but real nonetheless, perhaps more real, because it had been earned through honesty and work and the courage to risk her heart one more time. The garden waited for them, green and thriving in the desert heat. The ranch house stood solid against the wind, and the future, uncertain but promising, stretched ahead like the endless sky. Clara had come to Dust Valley to keep a promise to the dead. Instead, she'd found a promise to the living. And that, she thought, was exactly as it should be. The leaves began to turn in late September, painting the cottonwoods along the creek in shades of gold that reminded Clara of Philadelphia autumn. But unlike those gray city falls, here the gold was set against impossibly blue skies and red rock formations that seemed to glow in the slanting light. Clara had been at the ranch for nearly 3 months now, and the changing season felt like a marker of transformation, not just in the landscape, but in her life. The garden had exceeded every expectation. The Saturday market had become a regular fixture of their week, with customers now arriving early to ensure they got Clara's tomatoes, her crisp lettuce, her perfectly formed squash. She'd started taking orders, planning next year's crops based on demand, and the ledger showed profits that made Luke shake his head in wonder. "We'll be able to hire help come spring," he said one evening, reviewing the numbers. "Maybe even start that greenhouse you've been sketching in the margins." Clara looked up from where she was mending one of Luke's shirts, a domestic task she'd taken on not because she had to, but because she wanted to. "The greenhouse will require significant investment. We should make sure we have reserve capital first." "Listen to you," Luke said with affectionate amusement. "Reserve capital. 6 months ago, did you ever imagine you'd be discussing agricultural financing in a ranch house kitchen?" "6 months ago, I was measuring hems in a Philadelphia tenement," Clara said. "I never imagined any of this." Luke set down the ledger and crossed to where she sat, settling on the arm of her chair. His hands had healed completely, though thin scars remained across his palms, reminders of the mine rescue that had changed something fundamental between them. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "Philadelphia? The seamstress work? Your old life?" Clara considered this honestly. "I miss Evelyn. I miss my parents sometimes, even though they've been gone for years. But the city, the work, constant struggle just to survive? She shook her head. No, I don't miss that at all. And if you could go back, if someone offered you a successful seamstress shop in Philadelphia, financial security, everything you thought you wanted, I'd say no, Clara said without hesitation. Because everything I actually want is right here. Luke's smile was tender as he leaned down to kiss her forehead. Good, because I'd have a hard time letting you go. They'd settled into a rhythm over the past months, a domestic dance that felt both comfortable and charged with potential. Luke still slept in his room at one end of the hall, Clara in hers at the other. Propriety was maintained, barely, but the tension between them had grown sweet and heavy, like fruit ripening on the vine. Mrs. Chen had taken to visiting weekly, ostensibly to check on Clara's welfare, but really, Clara suspected, to assess the situation and ensure things were progressing appropriately. On one such visit, she found Clara in the kitchen making preserves from the last of the season's tomatoes. The garden has done well, Mrs. Chen observed, surveying the jars lined up on the counter. Better than anyone expected. Better than I expected, Clara admitted. The soil here is more responsive than I anticipated, and Luke's been invaluable. He has an instinct for the land, even if he doesn't always trust it. Mrs. Chen watched Clara work for a moment, her expression thoughtful. And the two of you? How does that progress? Clara felt heat rise in her cheek. We're taking things slowly, getting to know each other properly. You have known each other for 3 months, Mrs. Chen said pragmatically. You work together, live together, build together. How much more knowing is required? I just want to be sure, Clara said. After everything that happened with Evelyn, after the deception and the complications, I want to be certain we're choosing each other for the right reasons. And what would be the right reasons? Clara paused, considering love, partnership, a genuine desire to build a life together, not just convenience or loneliness or... Clara, Mrs. Chen interrupted gently. You love him. He loves you. You have already built a life together. The only question remaining is whether you will formalize what already exists. The words hit Clara with unexpected force because they were true. Somewhere in the past months, without quite meaning to, she and Luke had created exactly what Evelyn had dreamed of. A partnership, a home, a shared future. The only thing missing was the public acknowledgement, the legal bond that would make it official. I'm afraid, Clara admitted quietly, what if I'm not enough? What if he realizes he wanted Evelyn all along and I'm just a substitute? Mrs. Chen's expression softened. Luke Callahan does not see you as a substitute. He sees you as Clara, the woman who saved his ranch, who challenges him, who stands beside him as an equal. That is not a consolation prize. That is a choice. After Mrs. Chen left, Clara stood on the porch watching the sun descend toward the red rocks. The sky was performing its nightly miracle, painting itself in colors that still took her breath away. She heard Luke's footsteps behind her and felt his presence before he spoke. Penny for your thoughts, he said, coming to stand beside her. I was thinking about choices, Clara said, about how we end up where we end up. All the small decisions that lead to big changes. Like deciding to get on a train to deliver a letter in person. Like that, yes. Clara turned to face him. Luke, do you ever regret it? Placing that advertisement, writing to Evelyn, all of it? Luke's expression grew serious. I regret that Evelyn suffered. I regret that she didn't get to live the life she dreamed of. But regret the chain of events that brought you here? No. Never. Even knowing it started with deception? It started with love, Luke corrected. Evelyn's love for you, making you promise to come here. Your love for her, making you keep that promise. My loneliness and hope, making me seek connection in the first place. Deception was part of it, yes, but it wasn't the foundation. Love was. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. When did you become so wise? Probably around the time a stubborn woman showed up and refused to leave, forcing me to examine what I actually want from life. Clara laughed through her tears. I didn't refuse to leave. You asked me to stay. Because I knew, even then, that you were what I needed. Maybe not what I thought I wanted, but definitely what I needed. They stood together as darkness fell, and Clara felt something shift inside her, a last wall coming down, a final defense crumbling. She'd been holding back, keeping part of herself in reserve in case this all fell apart. But standing here with Luke, watching the stars emerge one by one, she realized that holding back was just another form of fear, and she was tired of being afraid. "Luke," she said quietly, "I'm ready." He turned to her, questions in his eyes. Ready for what? For all of it. For making this official, for committing fully, for whatever comes next. I'm ready to stop protecting myself from the possibility of loss and start embracing the possibility of everything else. Luke's face transformed, hope and joy and relief washing over his features. "Clara, are you saying—" "I'm saying yes," Clara interrupted. "To the question you haven't asked yet, but want to." "Yes." Luke pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her with fierce tenderness. "I don't have a ring. I have the one I bought for Evelyn, but that wouldn't be right. You deserve your own ring, your own proposal, your own—" "I don't need a ring right now," Clara said, pulling back to look at him. "I just need you to know that I'm choosing this. Choosing us. Choosing to build something permanent instead of temporary." Luke cupped her face in his hands, his expression almost reverent. "Clara Harper, I love you. I love your strength and your practicality and the way you see possibilities where others see obstacles. I love that you're honest even when it's hard, that you work until your hands bleed, that you've turned this ranch into something I'd stopped believing it could be. Will you marry me? Will you be my partner in every sense from this day forward?" "Yes," Clara whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." The kiss that followed was different from the others they'd shared, deeper, more certain, carrying the weight of commitment and the promise of a shared future. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Clara started to laugh. "What?" Luke asked, smiling at her joy. "I came here to deliver a letter," Clara said, echoing words she'd spoken months ago. "One letter, and I've ended up with a ranch, a business, and a husband." "Not a husband yet," Luke reminded her. "We still need to make it legal." "Details," Clara said, kissing him again. They decided to marry quickly and simply. Neither of them wanted a long engagement or an elaborate ceremony. Within a week, they'd made the arrangements, a simple service at the church, with Mrs. Chen and Jacob Miller as witnesses, and a small reception at the boarding house for whoever wanted to attend. The night before the wedding, Clara sat in her room, soon to be their room, and took out Evelyn's letter one final time. She'd read it so many times the creases were wearing thin, but tonight felt like the right moment for a final reading. Evelyn's words were as familiar as prayer now, but Clara focused on the ending, on her sister's final wish. If there's any chance at all that Clara might stay, that she might find in Dust Valley what I never could, please give her that chance. "I found it," Clara whispered to the empty room. "I found everything you wanted for me and more. I hope you can see this, wherever you are. I hope you know that your death wasn't meaningless, that good came from it, that I'm happy." She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the small box where she kept her most precious things. Her mother's wedding ring, a photograph of her parents, a pressed flower from the first harvest of the garden. These pieces of her past, preserved but no longer controlling her present. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thought. "Come in," she called. Luke entered, looking slightly sheepish. "I know it's bad luck to see the bride before the wedding, but I couldn't sleep. Keep thinking about tomorrow, about everything changing." "Nothing's changing," Clara said, standing to meet him. "Everything's just becoming official." Luke crossed to her, taking her hands. "I want you to know something. Tomorrow, when we say our vows, I'll be thinking about Evelyn too. About how grateful I am that she sent you here, that she cared enough about both of us to engineer this. She'll be part of our story always, and I want you to know that's all right with me." Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks. "I love you so much. For understanding that, for accepting all of it. The complications, and the history, and the fact that this isn't how anyone planned it." "The best things rarely are," Luke said, wiping away her tears with gentle thumb. "Now I should go before Mrs. Chen catches me in here and postpones the wedding on principle." He kissed her softly and left, and Clara climbed into bed feeling more at peace than she had in years. Tomorrow she would marry Luke Callahan. Tomorrow she would stop being Clara Harper and become Clara Callahan. Tomorrow, the life she'd been building would become irrevocably real. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, the October air crisp with the promise of winter but still warm in the sun. Clara dressed in the blue dress she'd worn to the church social, but Mrs. Chen had brought lace and ribbons, transforming it into something that could pass for a proper wedding gown. Martha Yates helped with her hair, pinning it up in an elegant style that made Clara barely recognize herself in the mirror. "You look beautiful," Martha said warmly. "Luke's a lucky man." "I'm the lucky one," Clara said, meaning it. The church was fuller than she'd expected. It seemed half of Dust Valley had turned out, curious about the woman who'd stepped off the train 3 months ago and stayed to marry the town's most eligible bachelor. Clara saw faces she recognized from the market, from the mine rescue, from daily life in this small community that had somehow become hers. Sarah Mitchell was there too, sitting near the back with a carefully neutral expression. Clara caught her eye and was surprised to see not hostility, but something closer to acceptance. Perhaps even Sarah had finally understood that some battles weren't worth fighting. And then the music started, and Clara's attention focused entirely on the front of the church, where Luke stood waiting. He wore the same suit he'd worn to the social, but he'd gotten a fresh shave and his hair was neatly combed, and the look on his face as he watched her walk down the aisle made Clara's heart stutter. The ceremony was simple and short, the Reverend keeping his remarks brief and focused. They exchanged vows that they'd written themselves, promises to work together, to be honest with each other, to build a life worthy of the sacrifices that had brought them to this moment. When Luke slipped the ring on her finger, a simple gold band he'd purchased in Silver Creek the week before, Clara felt the weight of it like an anchor tethering her to this place, this man, this future. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the Reverend said with a smile. "You may kiss your bride." Luke did, thoroughly and enthusiastically, and the church erupted in applause and cheers. Clara laughed against his lips, joy bubbling up from somewhere deep inside, and when they broke apart, she saw the same joy reflected in Luke's eyes. They walked back down the aisle together, and Clara caught Mrs. Chen's eye. The older woman was crying openly, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, and she mouthed, "I told you so," as they passed. Clara grinned and squeezed Luke's hand tighter. The reception at the boarding house was loud and cheerful, with food provided by half the town and music from the same band that had played at the social. Clara danced with Luke, with Jacob Miller, even with Morrison, who apologized for his wife's initial coldness and wished them both happiness. As the afternoon wore on and the celebration showed no signs of slowing, Luke leaned close to Clara's ear. "Think anyone would notice if we slipped away?" "Everyone would notice," Clara said, "but I don't think anyone would mind." They made their goodbyes to Mrs. Chen and thanked the assembled guests, then escaped to the wagon. The ride home was different this time. No tension, no uncertainty, just the warm satisfaction of promises made and kept. The ranch looked the same as it always had, but crossing the threshold felt different. This was truly Clara's home now, legally and completely. She was no longer a guest or a business partner or a woman trying to figure out where she belonged. She was home. Luke carried her over the threshold, tradition winning out over practicality, and set her down gently in the parlor. "Welcome home, Mrs. Callahan." "Mrs. Callahan," Clara repeated, testing the name. "I like the sound of that." They stood in the center of the room, suddenly shy despite everything they'd been through together. It was Luke who finally broke the spell, taking Clara's hand and leading her toward the stairs. "I should warn you," he said as they climbed. "I moved all your things to our room this morning. Figured there was no point in maintaining separate spaces anymore." Clara smiled. "Our room? I like the sound of that too." The room that had been Luke's was now theirs, Clara's belongings mingling with his in a way that felt natural and right. The bed had fresh linens, Mrs. Chen's doing, no doubt, and evening light streamed through the windows, painting everything golden. Luke turned to Clara, suddenly serious. "I want you to know something. I'm glad it's you. Not as a consolation for Evelyn not being here, not as a second choice or a happy accident. I'm glad it's specifically you, Clara. I wouldn't want anyone else." "I know," Clara said, and she did. She'd finally stopped comparing herself to the woman from the letters, stopped wondering if she measured up to what Luke had been expecting. She was herself, and that was enough. More than enough. What followed was tender and tentative and entirely theirs. A claiming and a surrender, a beginning and a culmination. Clara had worried that the physical aspect of marriage would be awkward, colored by inexperience and uncertainty. But with Luke, it felt natural, an extension of the partnership they'd already built in every other aspect of their lives. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the growing darkness, and Clara felt a contentment so complete it was almost overwhelming. Luke's fingers traced lazy patterns on her shoulder, and she could hear his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her ear. "Are you happy?" Luke asked quietly. Clara thought about the question, about happiness and how it manifested, about the journey that had brought her here. She thought about Evelyn, about Philadelphia, about all the pain and loss that had preceded this moment. "Yes," she said simply, "I'm happy." The weeks that followed the wedding were busy ones. Word had spread about the success of Clara's garden, and she began receiving letters from other struggling ranchers asking for advice. She started writing back, sharing her knowledge freely, and soon a network was forming, small gardens springing up across the valley, each one following the principles Clara had proven worked in this harsh climate. Luke watched with pride as his wife became not just the heart of their ranch, but a resource for the entire community. "You're changing this place," he told her one evening as she drafted a response to a rancher in the next county, "making it more sustainable, more resilient." "I'm just sharing what I know," Clara said. "What my father taught me, what I learned through trial and error." "You're doing more than that," Luke insisted. "You're giving people hope, showing them there are ways to thrive here, not just survive." News came in November that Jacobson had decided to invest in the mine after all, installing proper safety equipment and reinforcing the unstable sections. It wasn't entirely due to Luke's speech at the town meeting, but Clara knew that speech had played a part. Luke had reminded Jacobson, and everyone else, that Dust Valley was worth fighting for. The mine reopened in December with new safety protocols, and families who'd been preparing to leave unpacked their belongings and settled back in. Patrick, the miner Luke had saved, stopped by the ranch one Sunday to thank them both. "I owe you my life, Mr. Callahan," he said, shaking Luke's hand. "And Mrs. Callahan, I hear the whole garden idea started with you. My wife's using your techniques, and we're eating fresh vegetables for the first time in years. So I owe you both more than I can repay." "You don't owe us anything," Luke said firmly. "Just pay it forward. Help someone else when you get the chance." As winter settled over the valley, Clara and Luke spent long evenings planning for spring. They sketched designs for the greenhouse, calculated costs, discussed crop rotations, and expansion strategies. But they also spent time simply being together, reading by lamplight, talking about dreams and memories, learning each other in ways that went beyond the physical. On Christmas Eve, Luke surprised Clara with a gift. A beautiful leather-bound journal with her initials embossed on the cover. "For recording your techniques," he explained. "Your father's knowledge, your innovations, everything you're learning. It should be preserved, written down properly so it can be shared more widely." Clara was touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "It's perfect. Thank you." "There's something else," Luke said, pulling out a smaller package. "I wanted you to have this." Clara unwrapped it carefully to find a locket on a delicate gold chain. Inside were two tiny photographs, one of Clara and Evelyn together, taken years ago in Philadelphia, and one of Clara and Luke on their wedding day. "Past and present," Luke said softly. "Your sister brought us together, and I wanted you to have a way to carry both of you with me, if that's all right." Clara felt tears streaming down her face as she fastened the locket around her neck. "It's more than all right. It's perfect." They spent a quiet Christmas together, just the two of them, and Clara reflected on how different this was from Christmases past. In Philadelphia, the holiday had meant cold rooms and sparse gifts, the shadow of loss hanging over everything. Here, in this ranch house with her husband, there was warmth and plenty and the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. As the year turned and 1886 began, Clara discovered she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks but wanted to be certain before telling Luke. On a cold January morning, she finally found the courage. "Luke," she said over breakfast, "I have something to tell you." He looked up from his coffee, immediately alert to the serious tone in her voice. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "No, nothing's wrong. Actually, something's very right." Clara took a deep breath. I'm going to have a baby. We're going to have a baby. Luke's face went through a remarkable transformation, shock, then wonder, then pure joy. He stood so quickly his chair nearly toppled, crossing to Clara and pulling her into his arms. A baby, he whispered against her hair. Clara, we're going to have a baby. Are you happy? Clara asked, though his reaction made the answer obvious. Happy doesn't begin to cover it, Luke said, pulling back to look at her. Terrified, amazed, grateful, all of those things and more. When? Late summer, August, maybe early September. Luke's hand moved to her stomach, still flat beneath her dress. A summer baby, born during harvest season. Fitting, isn't it? Clara said with a smile. This whole thing started with planting seeds. Now we're growing something even more precious. The pregnancy was easier than Clara had feared, though morning sickness plagued her through February and March. Luke was attentive to the point of being overbearing, trying to prevent her from doing any heavy work, until Clara finally put her foot down. I'm pregnant, not dying, she told him firmly. I can still work the garden, still manage the house. You need to trust me to know my limits. I just don't want anything to happen to you, Luke said. To either of you. Clara softened at the worry in his eyes. Nothing's going to happen. I'm healthy, strong, we're going to be fine. As her belly grew and spring arrived, Clara found herself thinking often about Evelyn. How would her sister have felt about this? Would she have been happy that Clara had found love and was starting a family? Or would there have been sadness, regret for the life Evelyn herself never got to live? Clara chose to believe Evelyn would have been happy. After all, it was Evelyn who'd orchestrated all of this with her dying wish, who'd sent Clara west with instructions to stay if the opportunity arose. She'd wanted Clara to have exactly this: a home, a partner, a future filled with possibility. In late May, a letter arrived that made Clara catch her breath. It was from Philadelphia, from a lawyer she didn't recognize. With trembling hands, she opened it to find unexpected news. Her aunt's shop had finally sold, and after all debts were settled, there was a small inheritance. Not a fortune, but enough to make a difference. She showed the letter to Luke that evening. It's not much, but it's something. We could use it for the greenhouse, or to expand the herd, or we could save it for the baby, Luke suggested. Start an education fund. Make sure our child has opportunities we didn't. Clara felt warmth spread through her chest. Our child. I'm still getting used to saying that. Me too, Luke admitted. But I like it. I like thinking about teaching a son or daughter to ride, to work the land, to understand this place the way we do. What if it's a girl? Clara asked. What if she wants to do more than work the land? Luke looked at her seriously. Then we'll support her. Make sure she has the education and resources to do whatever she dreams of. Boy or girl, our child will have choices. That's what we'll give them, choices. As summer approached, the garden flourished under Clara's expert care, even as her growing belly made some tasks more challenging. She'd hired a young man named Tom to help with the heavier work, and he'd proven reliable and eager to learn. The greenhouse construction had begun in April, and by June its frame stood skeletal but promising against the sky. Clara stood admiring it one evening, one hand on her swollen belly, when Luke came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her, his hands covering hers. Next winter we'll be growing food in there, he said, providing fresh vegetables year-round. You've transformed this ranch, Clara, made it something I never dreamed it could be. We transformed it, Clara corrected. Together. That's how this works. Together. Together, Luke agreed, kissing her temple. On August 15th, on a day when the heat hung heavy and still over the valley, Clara's labor began. It was long and difficult, and there were moments when Clara wondered if she had the strength to see it through. But Mrs. Chen was there, experienced and calm, and Luke was there holding her hand, and Martha Yates assisted with quiet efficiency. As dawn broke on August 16th, Clara gave one final push and heard the most beautiful sound in the world, her baby's first cry. A girl, Mrs. Chen announced, placing the squalling infant on Clara's chest. A healthy, strong girl. Clara looked down at her daughter, red-faced and furious and absolutely perfect, and felt love so overwhelming it took her breath away. Luke was crying openly, his hand gentle on the baby's dark head. he whispered. "Clara, she's perfect." "What should we name her?" Clara asked, though she'd been thinking about this for months. Luke met her eyes, understanding passing between them. "I think we both know." "Evelyn," Clara said softly, looking down at her daughter. "Evelyn Harper Callahan. So that part of her lives on, so that the woman who brought us together is remembered." "Evelyn," Luke agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "The baby, Evelyn, their Evelyn, calmed in Clara's arms, her tiny fist curling around Clara's finger with surprising strength. Clara looked at her daughter and saw the future. This child would grow up knowing love and security, would have opportunities and choices, would understand that sometimes the wrong person arrives at exactly the right time. As the sun climbed higher and the day grew warm, Luke and Clara sat together in their room with their daughter, forming a family unit that had seemed impossible just a year ago. Clara thought about the letter that had brought her here, about Evelyn's dying wish, about all the unlikely events that had led to this moment. She'd come to Dust Valley with grief and guilt and a message to deliver. She'd expected to stay a few hours, to discharge her duty and move on to whatever came next. Instead, she'd found a home, a partner, a purpose, and now a daughter. Life, Clara had learned, didn't unfold according to plan. It unfolded according to choices. The choice to stay when you could leave, to trust when you'd been hurt, to love when you'd sworn you wouldn't risk it again. "What are you thinking?" Luke asked softly, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby. Clara looked at her husband, at their daughter, at the life they'd built together, fragments and hope and stubborn determination. "I'm thinking that Evelyn was right, that there was something worth finding in Dust Valley, something worth staying for." "And what was that?" Clara smiled, leaning into Luke's embrace. "Everything. Absolutely everything." Outside, the desert wind carried the scent of growing things. The garden in full production, the greenhouse nearly complete, the promise of another harvest. The red rocks stood eternal against the sky, and the sun traced its familiar arc toward evening. This was home now, deeply and completely. Not the home Clara had imagined when she'd boarded that train in Philadelphia, but something better, something real and earned and built with her own hands, something that would endure. Years later, when young Evelyn was old enough to understand, Clara would tell her about the aunt she was named for, about the letters that brought two strangers together, about the garden that became a business and the business that became a life. She would tell her daughter about choices and courage and the importance of keeping promises, even when they lead you somewhere unexpected. But for now, in this perfect moment, Clara simply held her family close and watched the sunset paint the sky in those nameless, beautiful colors. The woman who'd stepped off the train 15 months ago, uncertain, grieving, carrying a message for a stranger, that woman was gone. In her place was Clara Callahan, wife, mother, partner, pioneer. A woman who'd taken deception and loss and transformed them into something true. A woman who'd planted seeds in hostile ground and watched them grow into abundance. A woman who'd come to deliver a letter and stayed to build a legacy. The desert had kept its promise after all, Clara thought, as she kissed her daughter's soft head. It had taken everything she'd brought, her pain, her fear, her carefully guarded heart, and given her back something infinitely more precious. It had given her home. And that, Clara knew with absolute certainty as she sat surrounded by the love she had never expected to find, was exactly where she was meant to be. Not because fate had decreed it or because destiny had intervened, but because she'd made a choice to stay, to trust, to love, to build. The wrong woman had stepped off that train in Dust Valley, but somehow, impossibly, miraculously, she'd turned out to be exactly right.